Set. Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. Have you ever wondered how a quiet shepherd boy from the rugged hills of southern Iran could one day rule lands stretching from the Aon Sea to the edge of India and do it without turning every conquered city into ruins? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always enjoy picturing where everyone is settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the middle of the 550 CPC, the high plateau that would one day be called Persia was still a patchwork of Iranian-speaking tribes. The strongest group among them were the Mess, who had built a kingdom centered on the city of Ekatana in the Zagros Mountains. Their king, Aeages, held loose authority over several related peoples, including the Persians, who lived farther south in the region of Anshan. One of those Persians was a young man named Cyrus, son of Cambyses from the Achaemenid family. He had grown up learning the ways of horsemen and shepherds, moving with the seasons between summer pastures and winter valleys. Life on the plateau was simple. Families kept sheep and goats, planted barley in small fields near mountain streams, and gathered in small villages built of sundried brick. Cyrus spent his early years much like other boys of his clan. He rode bareback across open grasslands, practiced with the bow from a young age, and listened to the stories elders told around evening fires about the old days, when the tribes had wandered freely before the Mess grew powerful. Those stories carried a quiet sense of pride in their own lineage, yet also a practical acceptance that the Mess were currently the stronger power. Cyrus showed an early talent for leading small groups on raids against neighboring hill tribes and for settling disputes between families without unnecessary bloodshed. People noticed his steady manner. He spoke little but listened well, and when he gave orders they were clear and fair. By the time he reached his late 20s, Cyrus had become a respected leader among the Persian tribes. OGs watching from Ekatana grew uneasy about this capable young man on his southern border. According to later accounts, the Median king even had dreams that seemed to warn him of danger from his own daughter's line, though such stories were likely added afterward to explain what happened next. In any case, around 553 or 552 BCE, Cyrus openly refused to send the usual tribute and began gathering support from other Persian clans. The move was not sudden or loud. He spent months riding from village to village, talking with headmen, sharing meals, and reminding them of shared blood and shared interests. Slowly, the Persians came together under his lead. When Astyages finally sent an army south to bring the rebels back in line, the two forces met near the town of Passajdai in the Persian heartland. The battle that followed was not a long, drawn-out affair. Cyrus's men knew the local terrain, used the hills for cover, and kept their cavalry mobile. Many Median soldiers, it seems, were unhappy with Astyages and saw little reason to fight hard for him. Some units simply changed sides during the fighting. By the end of the day, the Median army had broken and Astyages himself was taken prisoner. Cyrus treated his former overlord with respect, keeping him alive and comfortable rather than executing him. This was the first clear sign of the approach that would mark Cyrus's entire career. With the Median defeat, the balance of power on the Iranian plateau shifted almost overnight. Cyrus did not destroy the Median court. Instead, he kept many of the same officials in place, married a Median princess to strengthen the tie between the two peoples, and moved the center of his growing realm gradually toward a new site he began developing at Passagjade. The city was laid out in a spacious style, with gardens, pavilions, and open colonnades that caught the mountain breezes. It was never meant to be a crowded capital like some older Mesopotamian cities. It felt more like an enlarged royal camp where leaders could gather, feast and plan without the weight of thick fortress walls. News of the victory spread quickly along the trade routes that crossed the plateau. Other Iranian tribes, the Parthians and Hyrcanians to the northeast, began sending messengers offering friendship. Cyrus accepted their gestures and confirmed their local rulers in exchange for military support when needed. He spent the next several years riding across the highlands, meeting with clan leaders, settling old blood feuds, and making sure that taxes were collected fairly and not taken by force. Where older Median governors had sometimes been harsh, Cyrus replaced them with men he trusted from his own circle. The change was noticed. People began to speak of the new ruler as someone who kept his word and did not punish entire communities for the actions of a few. Meanwhile, farther west, the kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia had grown rich from gold mines and busy trade. Its king, Cyrus, was famous for his wealth and for consulting oracles before making important decisions. When he heard that the mess had fallen, Croesus wondered whether the time had come to expand his own borders eastward. He gathered allies among the Greek cities on the Aegean coast and crossed the Halys River into former Median territory. Cyrus responded by marching west with an army that now included both Persian and Median horsemen. The two forces met in the spring of 547 BCE on the plain near the old Median border. The Lydian cavalry was strong, but Cyrus had prepared a clever tactic. He placed camels at the front of his lines. The smell of the unfamiliar animals spooked the Lydian horses, causing confusion in their ranks. After a hard day of fighting, the Lydians withdrew into their capital at Sardis. Cyrus followed and laid siege to the city. Within a short time, the walls were breached and Sardis fell. Again, Cyrus showed restraint. He spared Croesus' life, allowed the Lydian nobles to keep much of their property, and left local officials in many of their posts. The Greek cities of the coast, seeing how the new power treated its defeated enemies, mostly submitted without further resistance. Some even welcomed the change because Persian rule seemed lighter than the taxes and interference they had sometimes faced from Lydia. Cyrus did not stay long in the west. He left trusted governors behind and turned his attention back to the Iranian heartland. Over the next few years, he strengthened roads, made sure wells were dug along caravan routes, and encouraged merchants to travel safely under Persian protection. The empire was still young and its borders loose, but a pattern was already clear. Cyrus preferred to win loyalty through fair treatment rather than fear. He listened to local complaints, adjusted tribute levels when they seemed too heavy, and allowed each people to keep their own gods and customs as long as they accepted his overall authority. Back in the southern Persian valleys, the barley fields ripened under the same sun that had watched his boyhood. Elders who had known him as a youth now told younger listeners how the once modest leader had grown into a king who remembered where he came from. Cyrus himself continued to live simply when he was among his own people. He wore the same style of long tunic and trousers that ordinary Persian horsemen wore, ate the same bread and roasted meat they did, and slept in tents or modest halls rather than lavish palaces. This habit earned him quiet respect. Men felt they could speak openly to him, and he often settled disputes by asking both sides to explain their views before deciding. As the 540s BC continued, Cyrus looked south and east again. The great city of Babylon, once the heart of a powerful empire, had fallen on difficult times under its last ruler, Nabonidus. The king had spent long periods away from the city, focused on religious matters at distant temples, and left day-to-day government to his son, Belshazzar. Many Babylonians felt neglected. When Cyrus began moving his forces toward Mesopotamia, some inside the city quietly hoped for a change. In the autumn of 539 BCE, the Persian army approached Babylon. There was little fighting. The gates were opened from within, and Cyrus entered the city in a calm procession rather than as a conqueror storming the walls. Once inside, he made a point of visiting the main temples and offering respect to the god Marduk. He ordered that damage from any earlier unrest be repaired and that the traditional New Year ceremonies continue. Babylonian officials who had served under Nabonidus were kept in their positions if they swore loyalty. The change of power felt almost gentle. Merchants reopened their shops, farmers brought their harvest to market, and life along the Euphrates went on much as before. Only now under a new distant king who seemed content to let the city run itself as long as tribute arrived regularly and order was kept. Cyrus stayed in Babylon for several months. He used the time to meet with leaders from many of the smaller states that had once looked to Babylon for protection. He confirmed their local rulers, adjusted tax agreements, and made it clear that Persian forces would protect the trade roads that crossed their lands. Word of these arrangements traveled quickly in distant Phoenician ports and along the edges of the Arabian desert. People began to speak of the new Persian king as someone who brought stability rather than endless war. During this same period, Cyrus also dealt with a group that had been living in exile in Babylon for decades. The people of Judah had been carried away from their homeland by earlier Babylonian kings. Many of them had settled into life along the canals, working as scribes, merchants, and craftsmen. Cyrus issued orders that allowed any who wished to return to their ancestral land to do so. He even provided funds to help rebuild the temple in Jerusalem that had been destroyed years earlier. This decision was practical as well as generous. It created goodwill among a dispersed community and helped secure the roads leading toward Egypt and the southern trade routes. For the returning exiles, it marked the end of a long period of displacement and the beginning of a new chapter in their own story. By the late 530s BCE, the lands under Cyrus's control reached from the Aegean coast in the west to the deserts beyond the Iranian plateau in the east. He had not achieved this through constant slaughter or by erasing local identities. Instead, he had moved steadily, winning battles when necessary, but always trying to turn former enemies into useful partners. He kept a small core of Persian and Median nobles as his closest advisors. Yet, he was willing to learn from the older civilizations he now ruled. Babylonian astronomers taught his scribes better ways to track the seasons. Lydian metal workers showed Persian craftsmen new techniques, and Phoenician shipbuilders offered advice on naval matters. Even though the Persians themselves were not yet a seafaring people, Cyrus was now in his 50s. His hair had grayed, but he still rode with the same ease he had shown as a young man. When he moved through the countryside, he stopped to speak with farmers, asking about their crops and the condition of their irrigation channels. He ordered that damaged canals in Babylonia be repaired and that new wells be dug along the main roads through Media. These small improvements mattered to ordinary people. A farmer who could water his fields reliably was less likely to rebel. A merchant whose caravan could travel safely paid his taxes more willingly. In this way, the empire grew stronger, not just through conquest, but through quiet, steady care for the lands it now included. The court at Pasargadae remained the place Cyrus returned to whenever he could. There, in the gardens he had planted with trees brought from different regions, he would sit with his sons Cambyses and Bardia, discussing the future. Cambyses the elder was being prepared to take a larger role, learning how to deal with the various peoples of the West. Bardia stayed closer to the Iranian heartland, becoming familiar with the tribal leaders who still formed the backbone of the army. Cyrus made sure both boys understood that ruling well meant listening as much as commanding. As the decade drew toward its close, Cyrus began to look once more toward the eastern frontier. Nomadic groups beyond the Jaxartes River sometimes raided the settled lands. He wanted to secure those borders before turning his attention to other projects. In the spring of 530 BCE, he led a force eastward, moving through the high passes and into the steppe country. The campaign started well. Several tribes offered submission, but one group, the Massagate, led by their queen Tamaris, refused to yield. The fighting that followed was hard and took place far from the comfortable gardens of Passaged. Cyrus's army pushed deep into unfamiliar territory. In one of the last engagements, the king himself was caught in a fierce clash. He did not return from that campaign. News of his death reached the western provinces slowly. When it finally arrived, many people felt a genuine sense of loss. Cyrus had ruled for about 30 years. In that time, he had taken a collection of tribes and turned it into the largest political structure the world had yet seen. He had done so with remarkably little destruction. Cities that surrendered kept their walls and their gods. Farmers kept their fields. Merchants kept their roots. The Persian Empire under Cyrus was still young and its administration loose, but the foundations had been laid for something lasting. His body was brought back and buried in a simple stone tomb at Pasargadae. The structure still stands today, a modest house-like chamber on a raised platform surrounded by the quiet gardens he once walked. No grand statues or towering pyramids marked his resting place. Only a calm dignity that matched the way he had lived and ruled. Cyrus left behind a realm that stretched across 3 continents and included dozens of different languages and customs. He had shown that it was possible to hold such diversity together, not by forcing everyone into one mold, but by allowing each piece to keep its own shape while accepting a common authority. That idea would be tested and strengthened by those who came after him. For now, as the 530s BCE ended, the empire paused, caught between the memory of its founder and the uncertainties of what would come next. The shepherds in the southern hills still moved their flocks with the seasons. The barley fields still turned golden under the summer sun, and along the new roads that Cyrus had helped secure, caravans continued to travel, carrying goods and stories from one end of the growing realm to the other. The age of the Achaemenids had begun, quietly, steadily, and with a spirit that would shape the ancient world for generations. Victory over the Mess after the quiet passing of Cyrus in the eastern steppelands. The vast territory he had gathered did not collapse. The Persians and Mess had already begun to see themselves as partners in a single enterprise rather than rivals. In the years immediately following 530 BCE, the focus turned inward. Cyrus's elder son Cambyses, already familiar with the western provinces, took the throne with the support of the main Persian and Median nobles. The transition happened without major fighting inside the Iranian plateau. Cambyses had spent time learning the ways of the court at Pasargadae and the needs of the army. He understood that the strength of the new realm still rested on the loyalty of the tribal horsemen who formed its core. The first task was to confirm the arrangements Cyrus had made. Governors who had been left in charge of distant regions sent messengers confirming their allegiance. Tribute continued to flow along the roads that now connected Sardis in the west to the villages near the Indus in the east. Cambyses made a point of traveling through Media and meeting with the same families that had once served IA. He reminded them that the old Median royal line had been absorbed rather than destroyed. Many Median officers kept their commands in the cavalry units. This helped keep the peace on the plateau, while the new king turned his attention to unfinished business. One region still required attention. Egypt had long been a rich and powerful land along the Nile, and its rulers had sometimes interfered in the affairs of the smaller states in the Levant. Cambyses decided the time had come to bring the Nile Valley under Persian control. Preparations took several years. Supplies were gathered at the ports of Phoenicia, which had submitted peacefully after the fall of Babylon. Ships were hired from the seafaring cities along the Syrian coast. The army that assembled included Persian and Median horsemen, contingents from the Greek cities of Anatolia, and foot soldiers drawn from the settled lands of Mesopotamia. In 525 BCE, the Persian force moved south along the coastal road and then struck inland toward the Nile Delta. The Egyptian king Psammetichus III had gathered his own troops and hired Greek mercenaries to strengthen them. The two armies met near the border town of Palu. The battle was sharp, but did not last many days. The Persians used a combination of disciplined archers and mobile cavalry to break the Egyptian lines. Once the delta was secured, Cambyses marched up the Nile toward the ancient capital at Memphis. The city surrendered after a short siege. Again, the pattern established by Cyrus held. Cambyses did not allow widespread looting. He entered the main temples, offered respect to the local gods, and confirmed many Egyptian officials in their posts. The conquest brought the fertile lands of Egypt into the growing realm. Grain from the Nile could now help feed armies and cities farther north. Trade along the Red Sea routes became safer under a single authority. Cambyses spent time in Egypt learning about its ancient systems of irrigation and record-keeping. He appointed a Persian governor, but left day-to-day affairs largely in the hands of local nobles who had shown loyalty. For ordinary Egyptian farmers, the change meant little at first. They continued to plant their crops according to the annual flood, pay their taxes in grain or labor, and visit the same temples their ancestors had known. While Cambyses was away in the south, rumors began to spread back on the Iranian plateau. Some stories claimed that the king had gone mad or offended the gods. Others whispered that a member of the royal family had been mistreated. The exact details remain unclear, but discontent grew among a few nobles. In 522 BCE, while Cambyses was still in Egypt, a rebellion broke out in Persia itself. A man claiming to be Bardia, the younger brother of Cambyses, declared himself king. Many people accepted the claim at first because the real Bardia had been kept out of public view for some time. The pretender, later known in official records as Gumata, quickly gained support from those who felt the burdens of the new empire were growing too heavy or who simply wanted a change of ruler. Cambyses started back toward the plateau to deal with the uprising. On the journey north, he fell ill and died, probably in the spring of 522 BCE. His death left the empire without a clear leader for a short but dangerous period. The false Bardia ruled from the old Median centers for several months. He called some taxes and tried to win favor with the common people. Yet the core of the Persian nobility grew suspicious. They knew the real Bardia had been sent on a mission earlier and had not been seen for a long time. Among the nobles who doubted the new ruler was a man named Darius from a junior branch of the Achaemenid family. Darius had served as a spear-bearer in Cambyses' personal guard and had gained a reputation for clear thinking and steady courage. He gathered a small group of trusted companions, and in September of 522 BCE, they rode into the palace compound where the pretender was staying. In a swift action, they killed Gumata and his closest supporters. Darius then presented himself to the army and the nobles as the new king. He explained that the man they had followed was an impostor and that the true line of Cyrus must be restored. Many accepted his account, especially after he showed the body and allowed public viewing. The first weeks after the coup were tense. Not every province welcomed the news. Revolts broke out in several regions. In Babylon, a man named Nidon Tubal claimed to be a descendant of the old Babylonian kings and tried to restore independence. Similar uprisings appeared in Media, in the eastern provinces, and even in some of the western satrapies. Darius had to act quickly. He divided his forces and sent trusted commanders to each trouble spot, while he himself marched against the Babylonian rebel set. The campaign against Nidon Tubal was decided on the banks of the Tigris. Darius's smaller but better coordinated army crossed the river and defeated the Babylonian forces in 2 sharp engagements. Babylon itself opened its gates again without a long siege. Darius entered the city and followed the example set by Cyrus decades earlier. He offered sacrifices to Marduk and confirmed local laws. The rebel leader was captured and executed, but the ordinary people of the city were not punished. This quick success helped calm other wavering regions. One after another, the revolts were put down. In Media, a leader named Phraotes claimed to be a descendant of the old Median royal house. He gathered a large following among the mountain tribes. Darius sent an army under one of his companions, and after several months of hard fighting in the Zagros passes, the rebel was defeated and brought before the king. Similar actions took place in the east, where another claimant tried to stir the provinces near the Iranian desert. Each time the Persian forces moved with speed using the roads Cyrus had helped develop and the loyalty of local garrisons that had been left in place. By the middle of 521 BCE, most of the major rebellions had been crushed. Darius used this period of fighting to learn the real condition of the empire. He saw that the rapid growth under Cyrus and Cambyses had left the administration uneven. Some governors had grown too independent. Taxes were collected irregularly. Roads were not always maintained. Messages took too long to travel from one end of the realm to the other. The experience of putting down the revolts convinced him that stronger central control was needed if the empire was to survive. He began making notes and consulting with experienced officials from Babylon, Egypt, and the Iranian heartland. While the fighting continued, Darius also dealt with the question of royal legitimacy. He married Atossa, a daughter of Cyrus, to link his own line more closely with the founder of the empire. He made sure that the main Persian clans received honors and positions at court. At the same time, he kept a careful watch on the Median nobles to make sure their influence did not grow too strong again. The balance between the two peoples remained delicate but workable. By the end of 521 BCE, the immediate crisis had passed. Darius could now turn from warfare to the longer task of building a system that would hold the huge territory together. He had already shown himself to be a capable soldier. The next years would reveal whether he could also become an effective organizer. The empire that Cyrus had created through personal leadership and fair treatment now needed clear laws, reliable officials, and steady income if it was to last beyond the lifetime of any single king. Darius spent the winter of 521 to 520 BCE in the old centers of Media and Persia, listening to reports from every province. He asked governors how much grain their districts could produce, how many men they could send for military service, and what problems they faced with neighboring tribes. He ordered that all answers be written down in a standard way so he could compare one region with another. This habit of careful record-keeping became one of his lasting contributions. The revolts had shown the dangers of weak central authority. Darius decided that the time had come to divide the empire into clearer administrative units. Each unit would have a governor, usually called a satrap, who would be responsible for collecting taxes, keeping order, and providing troops when called upon. The satraps would be chosen from reliable Persian and Median families, but they would be watched by royal inspectors who traveled the roads and reported directly to the king. This new system was still being shaped, yet its basic outline was already forming in Darius's mind as he prepared to move the court and begin larger building projects. The Iranian plateau itself remained the heart of the realm. Its horsemen still provided the best cavalry. Its pastures still fed the royal herds. Its people still told stories around evening fires about the days when Cyrus had first united the tribes. Now, those stories included the name of Darius as the man who had saved the empire from falling apart after the death of Cambyses. The transition from the founder's personal style to a more structured government was underway. It would take years to complete, but the direction had been set during the difficult months of 522 and 521 BCE. As the new king looked out across the mountains from Ecbatana or Pasargade, he could see the same rivers and valleys that Cyrus had known as a boy. The difference was that those lands now formed part of something much larger. The challenge ahead was to make that larger whole function smoothly for the benefit of the king, the nobles, and the ordinary people who planted barley, tended sheep, and traveled the trade routes. Darius had survived the crisis of succession. The real work of building the Persian Empire was about to begin in earnest conquest of Lydia. The winter of 521 to 520 BCE passed quietly on the Iranian plateau once the last pockets of revolt had been cleared. Darius spent those months moving between Pasargade and Ecbatana, meeting with the men who had helped him seize the throne. He listened carefully to their accounts of what had gone wrong during the months of uncertainty. Some spoke of governors who had stopped sending regular reports. Others mentioned roads that had fallen into disrepair, so that messengers took far longer than they should. A few noted that taxes in certain districts had become irregular, leaving the royal treasury short of the silver and grain needed to pay the army. Darius took all of this in without anger. He simply asked more questions and had scribes write down the answers in lists that could be compared later. By the early months of 520 BCE, he felt ready to look beyond the immediate problems of the Iranian heartland. One region in particular needed attention. The western provinces that had once belonged to Lydia had remained calm during the recent troubles, but their loyalty rested on old agreements made under Cyrus. Darius decided it was time to make those agreements firmer and to bring the rich lands of western Anatolia more closely into the administrative system he was beginning to shape. He chose a trusted noble named Cyrus to act as governor in that area and gave him clear instructions to restore order along the coast and to make sure the Greek cities paid their proper share of tribute. Cyrus moved quickly. He traveled first to Sardis, the old Lydian capital that Cyrus had captured more than 25 years earlier. The city still showed signs of its former wealth. Its workshops produced fine dyed wool and worked gold into jewelry that traveled along the trade routes. Cyrus called together the local leaders and explained the new expectations. Taxes would be collected according to a fixed list rather than whatever a governor felt like demanding at the moment. In return, the king would guarantee protection for the roads and the ports. Most of the Lydian nobles accepted the arrangement because it brought predictability. The Greek cities along the Aegean coast, however, were more cautious. Some of them had enjoyed a loose relationship with the Persians and now worried that tighter control would mean higher payments. Darius followed up by sending small detachments of Persian and Median cavalry to key points along the main roads. These units were not large enough to feel like an occupation, but they were enough to remind everyone that the king could move forces westward, if needed. At the same time, he ordered repairs to the old royal road that ran from Sardis all the way back toward the Iranian plateau. Work crews widened narrow stretches, built new bridges over mountain streams, and set up way stations where travelers could rest and change horses. The work moved steadily through the spring and summer of 520 BCE. One city that required special care was Mytis on the Ionian coast. It was a busy trading port with strong ties to other Greek settlements. Its leaders had sent gifts to Cyrus after the fall of Sardis, but they had never been fully integrated into the Persian system. Cyrus invited the leading men of Mytis to Sardis for discussions. He offered them a clear deal. They could keep their own city laws and choose their own officials as long as they paid an agreed amount of silver each year and allowed Persian ships to use their harbor when needed. After some debate, the Malayans accepted. Similar agreements were reached with several other coastal cities. The process was not dramatic. It consisted of long meetings, careful lists of obligations, and the quiet movement of small garrisons to nearby hills. By the autumn of 520 BCE, most of the former Lydian territory was functioning under the new arrangements. Tribute in the form of gold, silver, and fine wool began to move eastward along the improved roads. Darius received regular reports at his court, and used the information to adjust the size of each district's payment. He noticed that some areas produced more grain than others, and that certain ports brought in valuable timber from the Black Sea region. These differences helped him plan how to supply future military campaigns without overburdening any single province. The conquest of Lydia under Cyrus had been swift and relatively bloodless. The work Darius carried out in 520 and 519 BCE was slower and quieter. It involved measuring fields, counting workshops, and writing down the names of local leaders who could be trusted. In one district, near the old Lydian gold mines, Darius ordered that a new accounting system be introduced so that the amount of metal extracted could be recorded accurately each season. This attention to detail meant that the royal treasury began to fill more steadily. The extra silver was used to pay craftsmen who were already starting work on new buildings back in the Iranian heartland. While these changes were taking place in the west, Darius also looked at the military forces stationed there. The cavalry units that had come from Media and Persia needed pasture and grain. Local farmers were encouraged to grow extra barley and to sell it at fixed prices to the army. In return, they received protection from raiding bands that sometimes crossed from the mountains. The arrangement worked well enough that by 519 BCE, the western provinces felt stable. Greek merchants from the coastal cities began to travel more freely to Sardis and even farther east, carrying olive oil and wine in exchange for spices and textiles from the Iranian plateau. Darius did not visit the western provinces in person during these years. He remained closer to the center of the empire, moving between Pasidae and the old Median capital at Ecbatana. From there, he could receive messengers more quickly and keep an eye on the eastern borders where nomadic groups still tested the frontier. Yet he made sure that the nobles who governed the west understood they served at his pleasure. If a governor failed to send accurate reports or collected more than the agreed tribute, he was replaced without delay. This steady pressure from the center helped prevent the kind of independence that had fueled the revolts of 522 BCE. The people of western Anatolia noticed the change gradually. Farmers in the river valleys planted their crops as before, but now they knew exactly how much they would owe at harvest time. Artisans in Sardis continued to work gold and weave fine cloth, yet they saw royal inspectors checking weights and measures to make sure trade was honest. The Greek cities kept their assemblies and their temples to local gods, but they also built small altars where offerings could be made for the health of the Persian king. Life continued in familiar rhythms. Only now those rhythms were linked to a larger system that stretched all the way back to the mountains of Iran. By the middle of 519 BCE, Darius felt confident enough about the western provinces to turn his attention to other matters. He ordered that a new set of royal seals be prepared so that official letters could be recognized easily across the empire. He also began planning a series of way stations along the royal road where fresh horses would be kept ready for messengers. Each station would have a small staff and enough grain to feed both men and animals. The work on these stations would take several years, but the foundation was laid during this period of consolidation in the former Lydian lands. The quiet work of 520 and 519 BCE showed Darius's practical side. He did not need new battles to prove his power. Instead, he strengthened the links that Cyrus had first created. The wealth of Lydia, once the prize of a single swift campaign, now flowed more reliably into the royal coffers. The roads that had carried Cyrus's army westward now carried regular reports, tribute, and trade goods in both directions. The empire was becoming less a collection of conquered territories and more a single political body with clear rules and steady expectations. Farmers in the Maya Valley harvested their grain and paid their share without complaint because they could see the benefit of safer roads. Merchants in Miatos loaded their ships with olive oil, knowing that Persian protection reduced the risk of piracy. Horsemen from the Iranian plateau who served in the western garrisons found good pasture and reliable supplies. Everyone involved gained something from the new order, even if the gains were modest and gradual. Darius continued to receive detailed lists from Ororoites and the other governors. He studied them in the evenings, comparing one province with another and making notes about adjustments that might be needed the following year. This habit of careful administration became part of the way the empire functioned. It was not exciting work, but it was necessary if the vast lands gathered by Cyrus were to remain united after the founders' death. The former Lydian territory once on the battlefield, was now being woven more tightly into the fabric of the Achaemenid realm through roads, records, and regular tribute. As the year 519 BC drew to a close, the western provinces stood calm and productive. The gold from the Lydian mines, the timber from the northern forests, and the grain from the river plains all moved eastward according to plan. Darius could look toward the future, knowing that one important section of the empire was functioning as he intended. The next steps would involve extending the same principles to other distant regions and beginning the great building projects that would give the empire visible centers of power. For now, the work in the west served as a quiet but solid foundation for everything that would follow. The fall of Babylon. The year 519 BCE ended with steady reports arriving at the court from the western provinces. Darius reviewed the lists of tribute and the accounts of road repairs while the winter snows covered the passes of the Zagros Mountains. Once the weather cleared in the early months of 518 BCE, he turned his attention southward toward the great river plains of Mesopotamia. Babylon had submitted peacefully to Cyrus nearly 20 years earlier, yet the city and its surrounding lands still operated with a large measure of independence. Local officials collected taxes and settled disputes, largely according to their own traditions. Darius decided the time had come to bring this rich and ancient center more firmly under central control without repeating the unrest that had followed the death of Cambyses. He chose a noble named Gubaru, who had experience in the region, to act as the new governor. Gubaru traveled south with a small escort and a group of scribes trained in both Persian and Babylonian record-keeping. When they reached Babylon in the spring of 518 BCE, they found the city busy with its usual trade. Boats moved along the Euphrates carrying grain, dates, and wool. Merchants from distant lands haggled in the markets near the great temple of Marduk. The massive brick walls that surrounded the inner city still stood as they had for centuries, but some of the outer defenses showed signs of neglect. Gubaru began by calling together the leading priests and city elders. He explained that the king wished to maintain the traditional festivals and the daily offerings in the temples. In return, the city was expected to send accurate records of its resources and to contribute a fixed share of its wealth each year. The priests listened carefully. They had seen earlier rulers come and go, and they knew that cooperation usually brought better treatment than resistance. After several days of discussion, they agreed to the new terms. Gubaru then ordered a fresh survey of the farmland along the canals. Teams of scribes measured the fields and recorded how much grain each district could produce under normal flood conditions. This information would help set a fair tax level that did not ruin the farmers. The work moved forward through the summer. New storehouses were built near the main gates to hold the royal share of the harvest. Guards chosen from local Babylonian families were placed in charge of these stores so that the people would see their own neighbors protecting the grain rather than foreign soldiers. Darius also ordered repairs to several important canals that had become clogged with silt. The improved water flow meant that more land could be planted the following spring. Farmers noticed the difference almost immediately and began to accept the new governor's authority more readily. By the autumn of 518 BCE, the first regular tribute shipment left Babylon for the north. It included silver bars, sacks of grain, and fine textiles woven in the city workshops. The caravan traveled along the well-maintained road toward the Iranian plateau, stopping at the new way stations Darius had ordered built. Messengers riding ahead carried detailed lists so that the king would know exactly what to expect. When the shipment arrived at Ecbatana, Darius examined the accounts himself and made small adjustments for the following year. The process was calm and businesslike. There were no dramatic battles or public executions. The ancient city simply began to function as one important part of a larger system. Darius made one further decision that helped secure Babylonian loyalty. He confirmed the traditional rights of the main temples and allowed the priests to continue managing their own lands and workshops. In exchange, the temple scribes started keeping their records in a way that could be understood by Persian inspectors who visited twice each year. The arrangement suited both sides. The priests kept their influence and their income, while the king gained reliable information and a steady flow of resources. Ordinary residents of the city continued their daily routines, much as before. They baked bread in outdoor ovens, drew water from the canals, and gathered in the evenings to hear stories about the old kings of Babylon. Now, those stories sometimes included respectful mentions of the distant Persian ruler who had brought order after a time of confusion. During 517 BCE, Darius extended the same approach to the smaller cities and towns that lay along the rivers north and south of Babylon. Teams of surveyors moved through the countryside, recording the number of date palms, the size of sheep flocks, and the condition of irrigation channels. Local headmen were asked to help with the counts and were given small rewards when their information proved accurate. This gentle method of gathering facts reduced suspicion and made the new tax system feel less like an outside imposition. By the end of the year, most districts had accepted the fixed payments and had begun delivering them on schedule. The improved administration brought practical benefits. Safer roads meant that merchants could travel between Babylon and the western provinces without hiring large, armed escorts. Grain moved more freely to feed the garrison stationed near the Zagros passes. Silver from Babylonian workshops helped pay the craftsmen who were starting to gather at new building sites in the Iranian heartland. The city itself grew busier. New workshops opened along the riverbank, and the harbor saw more boats arriving from the south. Life inside the great brick walls continued at its own steady pace. Only now it was linked more closely to the rhythms of the larger empire. Darius did not need to visit Babylon in person during these years. He received regular reports and adjusted policies from his court in the highlands. When problems arose, such as a district that fell behind on its deliveries because of unusually low floods, he allowed the governor to reduce the payment for that season rather than punish the farmers. This flexibility prevented small difficulties from growing into larger resentments. The approach matched the style Cyrus had used decades earlier, but it was now supported by written records and regular inspections that made the system more reliable. As 516 BCE began, the integration of Babylonia was largely complete. The great ziggurat of Marduk still rose above the city, and the annual New Year festival continued with its traditional processions. Persian officials attended the ceremonies as guests rather than masters, showing respect for the ancient customs set. In the countryside, the farmers planted their barley and tended their date groves according to the same calendar their grandfathers had followed. They paid their taxes in grain or silver, but they also saw new bridges and cleared canals that made their work easier. The balance seemed fair to most people. The quiet incorporation of Babylon provided Darius with resources he would soon need for larger projects. The silver and grain that arrived each year helped support the growing number of skilled workers who were being brought together in the south of the Persian homeland. Plans for new royal centers were already taking shape, and the steady income from Mesopotamia would make those plans possible. At the same time, the successful handling of Babylonia served as a model for how other ancient and proud regions could be brought into the empire without constant military pressure. By the middle of 516 BCE, Darius could look at the map of his realm and see a more connected territory. The western provinces supplied gold and timber. The river plains supplied grain and silver, and the Iranian plateau supplied the horsemen and the central leadership. The roads and the record-keeping system tied these pieces together. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus had been a single dramatic event in 539 BCE. The incorporation of Babylonia under Darius was a slower, quieter process spread across several years, yet the result was deeper and more lasting. The ancient city and its surrounding lands had become a working part of the Achaemenid Empire rather than a loosely attached prize. Farmers along the canals harvested their crops and delivered the royal share without complaint. Merchants unloaded their boats and paid the fixed harbor fees. Priests performed their daily rites and kept their temple accounts in order. The great brick walls that had witnessed so many changes over the centuries now stood guard over a city that was learning to thrive under new distant masters. The empire continued to grow, not through fresh conquest in this region, but through careful administration and practical cooperation. Darius had turned the old Babylonian heartland into a reliable pillar of his realm, and the work done there, in the years after 518 BCE, would support everything he planned to build in the years ahead, a policy of tolerance. The success in Babylon encouraged Darius to apply the same principles of respect for local ways throughout the empire. He believed that people who could keep their own gods and customs would be more likely to accept Persian rule and contribute willingly to the common good. In the years after 516 BCE, He began issuing clear instructions to governors in every province that followed this thinking. Where revolts had damaged temples or shrines, royal funds were sent for repairs. Local courts continued to settle everyday disputes according to their own traditions. Festivals that had been part of community life for generations went on without interference as long as the required tribute arrived on time. In Judah, the small community of returned exiles had been working for years to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus had given permission for the project decades earlier, but the work had slowed because of local difficulties and limited resources. Darius reviewed the reports from the region and ordered that the construction receive additional support from the provincial treasury. In 516 BCE, the temple was finally completed and dedicated in a quiet ceremony attended by priests and elders. The event brought a sense of renewal to the families who had made the long journey back from Babylon. Farmers in the surrounding hills continued to plant their olive trees and barley fields, now with the added confidence that their religious center stood once more. Tribute from the area remained modest. Yet the goodwill created by the king's support meant that the roads through Judah stayed safe and trade with neighboring districts increased steadily. Similar steps were taken in Egypt. Although the Nile Valley had come under Persian control under Cambyses, some temples had suffered during the unrest of the early years. Darius instructed the governor there to consult with Egyptian priests about necessary repairs. Funds were allocated for work at the Temple of Petar in Memphis and at several smaller shrines along the river. Local craftsmen received payments in grain and silver for their labor, and the daily offerings continued as before. Egyptian farmers along the canals noticed that their priests spoke favorably of the distant ruler who did not demand changes to their ancient rites. The grain shipments from the delta to the north grew more reliable because the people felt their way of life was protected rather than threatened. Darius made sure that these actions were recorded in the local languages so that officials and priests could read them without translators. In Babylon, the scribes continued to use cuneiform for temple accounts, while Persian inspectors learned enough of the script to check the figures. In the western provinces, the Greek cities kept their own dialects for public notices. Yet, they also posted copies of royal decrees in a simple Aramaic that merchants could understand across the empire. This practical approach to language helped reduce misunderstandings and made the central government feel less remote. The policy extended even to smaller groups on the edges of the realm. In the eastern highlands beyond the Iranian plateau, tribal leaders who had supported the revolts were allowed to keep their traditional grazing rights once they swore loyalty. Darius sent messengers confirming these rights in writing and included small gifts of horses and cloth to seal the agreements. The nomads returned to their seasonal movements without further fighting, and their young men began to join Persian patrols when called upon. Far to the west in the Aon region, the coastal cities maintained their temples to local deities and their annual games. Persian governors attended some of these events as observers rather than rulers, showing that the king valued the customs that kept communities strong. Ordinary people across the vast territory noticed the difference in daily life. A weaver in Sardis could take her dyed wool to market, knowing that the same weights and measures used under Lydian kings were still accepted. A date grower near the Euphrates paid his tax in kind, but received a receipt written in familiar script that protected him from extra demands. A shepherd in the Zagros Mountains drove his flock to summer pasture without fear that a new official would claim part of the herd. These small certainties added up. Families planned their seasons with more confidence, and villagers repaired their own irrigation ditches and storage bins because they knew the larger system supported rather than disrupted their efforts. Darius himself spent time reviewing reports from each province about how the policy was working. He kept a staff of scribes who organized the information by region and by type of request. When a temple in a distant satrapy asked for cedar wood for roof beams, the king approved the shipment from Lebanon and noted the cost so that future governors could learn from the example. When a group of merchants in a border town requested protection for their caravan route, they asked the king for protection. He ordered a small garrison moved closer and reminded the local satrap to consult with the traders before setting fees. This attention to detail came from his experience during the revolts, when he had seen how resentment over ignored customs could quickly turn into open rebellion. The approach also shaped the way the army was supplied. Soldiers from the Iranian heartland, who served in Egypt or Anatolia, were told to respect local food taboos and festival days. In return, communities provided grain and food without resentment. A Persian cavalry officer stationed near the Nile learned to time his patrols around the planting and harvesting seasons so that farmers were not pulled away from their fields. These practical adjustments meant that garrisons remained well-fed and the provinces stayed calm. Tribute flowed more steadily because people saw that the king's representatives listened to their concerns rather than simply issuing orders. By the early years of the 510s BCE, the results were visible in the growing network of roads. Travelers moved more freely because they knew that local laws would protect them in each district. A caravan from Suar to Sardis carried spices and textiles without needing constant armed escorts. Messengers carrying reports from governors could stop at way stations and expect fair treatment under the same rules that applied at home. The policy of tolerance had become part of the daily machinery of the empire, not just a set of royal proclamations. It allowed Darius to focus on larger projects without constant worry about uprisings in distant lands. In the royal centers that were beginning to take shape, artisans from many regions worked side by side. Stone carvers from Egypt shaped columns for new halls, while woodworkers from the Levant fitted doors and window frames. Potters from Babylon brought their glazing techniques, and metal workers from the Iranian tribes added their skill with gold inlay. Each group followed its own methods, yet contributed to the same buildings. Darius made a point of visiting the workshops when he could, asking questions about the different traditions and encouraging the craftsmen to teach one another useful tricks. The resulting structures reflected the diversity of the empire without forcing everything into a single style. The policy also influenced how justice was administered. Darius ordered that major cases involving more than one province be heard by royal judges who knew the laws of all the parties involved. In practice, this meant that a dispute between a Phoenician trader and a Median landowner was settled according to the customs of both with a Persian official, making sure the decision was fair. Smaller matters stayed in local hands. A village elder and media could decide grazing rights among families using the same rules his grandfather had used. This balance kept communities intact and reduced the number of appeals that reached the king. As the decade continued, Darius extended the same thinking to the eastern frontiers. Tribes beyond the Jaxartes River received confirmation of their traditional hunting grounds once they agreed not to raid settled lands. Messengers carried royal seals that guaranteed these rights, and small gifts of tools and cloth accompanied the documents. The arrangement turned former raiders into partners who helped guard the trade routes instead of disrupting them. Far to the south in the Indus region, local rulers kept their titles and their courts while sending agreed amounts of gold and ivory each year. The people there continued to worship in their own temples and to follow their seasonal calendars without outside interference. The human impact of these decisions was felt in everyday conversations around evening fires and market stalls. A father in a Babylonian canal village could tell his sons that the king in the distant highlands respected the god Marduk and therefore kept the water flowing fairly. A mother in a Lydian hillside town could teach her daughters the old weaving patterns, knowing that the royal inspectors cared more about honest weights than about changing the designs. These quiet assurances built a sense of belonging that no army alone could create. The empire grew stronger because its many peoples felt they had a place within it rather than under it. Darius continued to receive regular updates on how the policy worked in practice. He adjusted instructions when necessary, always favoring the lightest touch that still maintained order. By the middle of the 510s BCE, the realm had settled into a rhythm where local customs and central authority supported each other. The roads carried not only tribute and troops, but also the steady exchange of goods and ideas that came from allowing diversity to flourish. Temples stood repaired, festivals continued, and families planned their futures with more certainty. The policy that had helped Cyrus win loyalty decades earlier was now woven more deeply into the daily life of the empire under Darius. It became one of the quiet forces that held the vast territory together through good years and difficult ones alike. The work of these years also freed Darius to turn his attention toward the great building projects that would give the empire visible centers of power. With the provinces calmer and more productive, resources could be directed to the south of the Persian homeland, where new royal centers were beginning to rise. The policy of tolerance had done its part. It had turned a collection of recently rebellious regions into a functioning whole where people of many backgrounds could live and work under one authority without losing their own identities. The empire continued to expand its reach, yet it did so with a steadiness that came from understanding the value of letting each part keep what made it strong. Eastern expansions and frontier challenges. With the provinces now functioning more smoothly and resources flowing with greater regularity, Darius shifted his focus toward the eastern edges of the realm, where the Iranian plateau gave way to vast steppes and river valleys that had not yet been fully drawn into the empire's structure. In the mid-510s BCE, he began organizing expeditions that would push Persian authority deeper into Central Asia and as far as the Indus River. These moves were not sudden invasions launched on a whim. Instead, they grew out of careful reports from frontier governors who described raids by nomadic bands that disrupted trade caravans and threatened settled farming communities in the border districts. Darius gathered a core force of Persian and Median cavalry, supplemented by contingents from Media and the eastern Iranian tribes who knew the terrain well. The army moved out from the highlands in stages, first securing supply lines along the existing roads and then advancing through the high passes that led toward the Oxus River. The landscape changed gradually as the columns descended from the plateau. Dry grasslands stretched for days in every direction, broken here and there by shallow rivers lined with popular trees. The nomads who lived in this country followed their herds of sheep and horses according to the seasons, living in portable, felt tents and relying on bows and short swords for both hunting and fighting. Darius's commanders had studied earlier accounts of these groups and prepared by carrying extra grain and water skins, so the army could keep moving even when local supplies were scarce. Small scouting parties rode ahead each day, mapping water sources and noting the locations of seasonal camps. When contact was made with the first nomadic bands, the Persians offered terms rather than immediate battle. Leaders who agreed to recognize the king's authority received gifts of cloth and metal tools and were allowed to keep their grazing lands. Those who refused faced coordinated attacks in which the Persian cavalry used its mobility to outflank and scatter the raiders. One of the first major successes came in the region later known as Bactria, where fertile river valleys supported villages of farmers who grew wheat and millet. The local people had long traded with merchants from the Iranian plateau, but had never paid regular tribute. Darius's forces reached the area after crossing several mountain ridges. They established a garrison at a strategic river crossing and invited the village headmen to a meeting. The discussions lasted several days. In the end, the Bactrians accepted a satrap from a trusted Persian family and agreed to send a fixed amount of grain and horses each year. In return, the Persians promised to protect the valleys from further raids by more distant tribes. The arrangement brought immediate benefits. Farmers could plant their fields without posting lookouts, and caravans began to travel the route more frequently, carrying lapis, lazuli, and other stones prized for carving. From Bactria, the army turned northward toward the lands along the Jaxartes River. Here the country became drier and the nomads more mobile. The Saka tribes, skilled horsemen who could shoot arrows while riding at full gallop, tested the Persian advance with hit-and-run attacks. Darius responded by dividing his forces into smaller units that could cover more ground and by building temporary forts at key watering places. These structures were simple earth and timber enclosures stocked with grain and arrows so that small detachments could hold out until reinforcements arrived. The tactic worked. After several months of maneuvering, the main Saka group sent representatives offering submission. Darius confirmed their leaders in their positions and required only that they provide warriors for the royal army when called and that they refrain from raiding the settled districts to the south. The frontier stabilized, and the Jaxartes became a practical boundary that the empire could defend without stretching its resources too thin. Farther east, the campaigns reached into the high valleys that led toward the Indus River. This region, known to the Persians as Gandhara, was greener and more varied, with forests on the lower slopes and broad plains along the river. Local rulers here had maintained loose ties with the older civilizations of the Indus Valley, but had never been part of a single large political system. Durrai's forces arrived after a long march that tested the endurance of men and animals alike. They moved in smaller columns to make better use of the narrow passes and to avoid exhausting the limited forage. When they reached the main settlements, the Persian commanders repeated the pattern that had worked elsewhere. They offered protection for trade routes in exchange for tribute in the form of gold dust, ivory, and fine timber. Most of the local chiefs accepted after seeing that the newcomers did not destroy crops or interfere with village temples. A new satrapy was organized with its center at a fortified town that served as a collection point for the annual payments. The extension of authority to the Indus brought practical advantages that Darius noted in his records. Gold from the river sands could now be collected systematically and sent back to the royal centers to support building projects. Merchants from the western provinces began to travel the long road eastward, exchanging Babylonian textiles for Indian spices and gems. The empire's eastern frontier now touched lands that produced goods previously available only through distant middlemen. At the same time, the new satrapies supplied additional cavalry units familiar with steppe warfare. These horsemen were integrated into the royal army and taught Persian officers their techniques for long-distance scouting. The exchange of skills strengthened the entire military structure. While the main campaigns were underway, Darius ordered the construction of way stations and small forts along the new routes. Each station was placed a day's ride apart and staffed by local recruits who received regular pay and grain. The system allowed messengers to travel from the Indus back to the Iranian heartland in a fraction of the time it had taken before. Reports from the eastern governors now reached the king within weeks rather than months. This speed helped him respond quickly when minor troubles arose, such as a dispute over grazing rights between two tribes. Instead of sending a large force, he could dispatch a single inspector with clear instructions preventing small problems from growing into larger conflicts. The people who lived in these newly organized districts noticed the changes in their daily routines. Farmers in the Bactrian valleys could leave their tools in the fields overnight because patrols kept watch against raiders. Herders along the Jaxartes moved their flocks to summer pastures, knowing that the Persians would not seize animals without payment. Traders in Gandhara loaded their pack animals with goods and followed the marked roads without hiring extra guards. The stability encouraged more families to settle in the border areas, clearing new fields and digging irrigation channels that extended the reach of cultivation. Within a few years, the volume of tribute from the east had increased enough to support additional garrisons and to fund the improvement of the main highway that linked everything back to Susa and Pepololis. Darius kept close track of these developments through the detailed lists sent by the new SAT traps. He adjusted the required payments according to the productivity of each district, lowering them in years of poor rainfall and raising them slightly when the harvests were abundant. This flexibility prevented resentment and kept the local leaders cooperative. At the same time, he made sure that Persian officials stationed in the east learned the basic customs of the region so that misunderstandings could be avoided. Some of these officials even married into local families, creating personal ties that strengthened loyalty across generations. By the late 510s BCE, the eastern expansions had added significant territory without the heavy fighting that might have been expected. The nomads who had once threatened the borders were now partners who supplied horses and scouts. The river valleys that had been loosely organized were now linked by roads and regular administration. Trade caravans moved with greater confidence, carrying goods that enriched both the frontier districts and the imperial centers. The empire's reach now extended to the edge of the Indian subcontinent, bringing it into contact with new resources and new peoples while maintaining the same principle of allowing local customs to continue. The campaigns also provided Darius with useful information about the geography beyond the Indus. Scouts reported on the great river's course and on the fertile plains that lay farther south. Although no immediate plans were made to advance deeper, the knowledge was stored for future reference. In the meantime, the king ordered that maps be drawn, showing the new satraps and the routes that connected them. These documents were copied and kept in the royal archives so that governors in later years could consult them when planning their own movements. As the decade drew toward its close, the eastern frontier had become a stable and productive part of the realm. The same roads that carried tribute also carried ideas and techniques in both directions. Metalwork skills from the Iranian tribes spread to Gandhara, while knowledge of river navigation from the Indus helped Persian engineers improve canal systems back in Babylonia. The expansions had served their purpose. They secured the borders, added wealth, and demonstrated that the empire could grow steadily without exhausting its strength. Darius could now turn his attention to the great building projects in the south, with the confidence that the distant provinces would continue to support the center. The work in the east had been methodical and practical, fitting the pattern that had guided the empire's development from its earliest days. The nomads, who had once lived beyond the reach of any king, now sent their young men to serve in the royal cavalry. The farmers in the river valleys paid their fixed taxes and received protection in return. The merchants who crossed the high passes knew they could rely on the way stations for safety and supplies. These quiet arrangements, built on the foundation of earlier tolerance and careful administration, turned the challenging eastern lands into a reliable extension of the Persian realm. The frontier had been pushed forward not by endless war, but by a combination of military skill, fair dealing, and steady organization. The empire continued to function as a single connected whole, with its eastern edge now firmly anchored and contributing to the prosperity that would support everything still to come. Life in the early Persian realm. The eastern satrapies sent their first regular tribute shipments back to the court. In the late 510s BCE, Darius reviewed the accounts and noted how the new provinces supplied horses and grain that reminded him of the sturdy resources the Iranian heartland had provided from the beginning. Those resources had come from the everyday routines that had sustained the Persians, and during the years when Cyrus was first uniting the tribes in the 550s and 540s BCE. In those days, the High Plateau was still a land of scattered clans rather than a single empire, yet the patterns of work and rest that shaped daily existence already carried the quiet strength that would support everything larger. At the top of the social order stood the king and his closest family. Cyrus lived among them, not in grand isolation, but as the head of an extended household that included relatives and trusted advisors from the leading clans. They moved with the seasons between the southern valleys and the higher pastures, consulting with one another around campfires or in simple halls built of stone and timber. Decisions about alliances or raids were made after hearing everyone's view, and the king often joined in the practical tasks of checking the herds or inspecting the fields. This hands-on approach kept the royal circle connected to the land and the people. Below them came the nobles and clan leaders, men from families that traced their lines back through generations of horsemen. They commanded groups of warriors, managed larger herds of cattle and sheep, and oversaw the planting of barley in the fertile pockets near mountain streams. Their households included servants who helped with the daily chores, but the nobles themselves rode out with their men to patrol borders or settle disputes between villages. Life for them centered on loyalty to the king and to one another, sealed by shared meals and joint hunts that tested skill with bow and lance. The largest group consisted of the free warriors and farmers who formed the backbone of Persian and Median society. These men owned small plots of land or shared grazing rights with their kin. In spring, they planted barley and millet in the valleys using wooden plows pulled by oxen. During the summer months, they moved the flocks to higher pastures, living in tents of felt and wool, while the women and children tended the camp. Autumn brought the harvest and the return to winter villages of sundried brick. The men practiced archery and horsemanship year-round, because every able-bodied freeman could be called to serve in the army when needed. Their days followed a steady rhythm of work at dawn, rest in the heat of midday, and evening gatherings where stories of past raids and good grazing were told. Priests, known as magi, held a respected place outside the ordinary clan structure. They tended the sacred fires that burned continuously in open-air shrines, offered simple prayers at dawn and dusk, and advised on matters of timing for planting or important journeys. They did not form a separate caste that lived apart. Many came from the same families as the farmers and joined in the seasonal movements. Their knowledge of the stars helped track the changing seasons, and their presence at festivals reminded everyone of the larger order that guided human affairs. Artisans and craftsmen occupied a smaller but essential layer. Metal workers shaped bronze bits for horses and iron tools for farming. Potters turned out sturdy jars for storing grain and oil. Weavers produced the wool cloth that everyone wore. These specialists often lived in larger villages near sources of clay or ore, trading their goods for food and livestock. Their workshops were open to the air, and young apprentices learned by watching and helping until they could work independently. At the base of society were the peasants and laborers who worked the fields or tended animals for the nobles. Many had come from families displaced by earlier conflicts or had chosen to attach themselves to stronger clans for protection. They received a share of the harvest and grazing rights in return for their labor, and they could own small personal items such as tools or a few sheep. Slaves, usually prisoners taken in minor raids, performed heavier tasks in the royal or noble households. Yet their numbers remained limited, and their treatment was regulated by custom rather than harsh law. Subject people who had recently accepted Cyrus's authority kept their own social arrangements within their districts. In the Lydian lands, craftsmen continued to work gold as they had before, while Babylonian farmers tended palms along the canals. The Persians did not impose their village structure on them. Instead, they required only that local leaders collect the agreed tribute and maintain order. This allowed each group to follow the habits that suited its land and climate while contributing to the common defense. Clothing across the Iranian plateau reflected both practicality and the wearer's place in society. Most men wore loose trousers of wool or linen tucked into soft leather boots that reached mid-calf, topped by a knee-length tunic belted at the waist. Nobles added a longer cloak of finer wool dyed in deep reds or blues, fastened with a simple bronze pin. Warriors favored shorter tunics for ease of movement and often wrapped a length of cloth around their heads as protection from sun and dust. Women dressed in long, straight gowns of similar material, sometimes layered with a shawl for warmth. In the evenings, children wore miniature versions of adult clothing, learning early how to adjust their garments for riding or working in the fields. Colors carried meaning. White for priests at ceremonies, brighter patterns for nobles on special occasions, and plain earth tones for daily labor. The cloth itself came from the sheep and goats that graze nearby, spun and woven by the women during the quieter winter months. Food followed the seasons and the resources of the highland valleys. Barley was the staple grain, ground into flour for flatbread, baked on hot stones, or cooked into a thick porridge flavored with wild herbs. Families kept small herds of sheep and goats, providing meat for feasts or special days, and milk that was turned into cheese and yogurt stored in clay jars. In autumn, the men hunted wild game in the hills, adding venison or birds to the pot. Fruits, such as apples, pears, and grapes, grew in irrigated gardens near the villages. The grapes were pressed into a light wine that was diluted with water for daily drinking. Dates and nuts arrived through trade from the south, while olive oil from the western provinces began to appear after the early conquests. Meals were simple and shared. Breakfast might be bread and cheese before the day's work. Midday, a quick handful of dried fruit and nuts during rest, and the evening meal, a stew of barley, vegetables, and whatever meat was available, eaten around the fire with the whole household. Nobles at Pagaday occasionally served larger roasts of lamb or beef when guests arrived, but even then, the focus remained on generous portions rather than elaborate display. Daily habits were shaped by the need to move with the land. In spring, the villages emptied as families drove their animals upward, repairing tents and checking water sources along the way. Summer brought long days of hurrying and the careful rationing of grass to keep the flocks healthy. Harvest time in late summer meant everyone worked together, cutting the barley with sickles and threshing it on hard-packed earth floors. Winter was the season for mending tools, telling stories and planning the next year's movements. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, practicing on gentle ponies, while older boys joined their fathers on patrols. Women managed the household, prepared food, washed cloth, and cared for the younger ones. Yet they also rode when the group moved camp and joined in the seasonal festivals. Festivals marked the turning points of the year. At the spring, equinox families gathered at the open shrines to offer thanks for the new growth and to share the first milk of the season. In autumn, after the harvest, they held larger gatherings with music from simple reed flutes and drums, where young men demonstrated their skill with bow and lance. These events reinforced the bonds between clans and reminded everyone of their place in the larger community. The Magi led the prayers, but the celebrations themselves were open to all free families. Trade with the different groups together, even in these early years. Merchants traveled the rough tracks between villages, carrying extra wool cloth, metal tools, or small amounts of salt from the southern deserts. They returned with news from distant valleys, and sometimes with goods from the lands that had recently come under Cyrus's protection. The exchange was small-scale and personal, conducted by handshake and spoken agreement rather than written contracts. The climate of the plateau dictated much of the routine. Hot, dry summers required careful storage of water and grain, while cold winters brought snow to the higher passes and forced families to huddle in their brick houses around central hearths. Everyone learned from childhood how to read the signs of approaching storms or the first green shoots after rain. This shared knowledge created a practical wisdom that passed from one generation to the next without need for formal schools. Even as Cyrus's armies moved westward and southward, the core population on the plateau continued these same patterns. The men who rode out to fight returned to their fields and flocks when the campaigns ended. The women who had managed the villages during their absence welcomed them back with the familiar meals and the steady routines that had sustained the community. Subject people in the newly attached regions noticed that the Persians expected no changes to local ways of dressing or eating. The tribute was collected in the form of whatever each district produced best. Whether Lydian gold, Babylonian grain, or Egyptian linen, the simple, resilient life of the early realm produced the soldiers and leaders who carried Cyrus's vision forward. Young men who had spent their boyhood herding sheep and practicing with the bow became the reliable cavalry that won battles without unnecessary destruction. Families that had learned to share resources during lean seasons understood the value of fair treatment for conquered peoples. The social order, though not yet elaborate, rested on mutual respect and practical cooperation that would later support the more complex administration Darius was beginning to build. By the time the eastern expansions were complete in the 510s BCE, the foundations laid during Cyrus's years of growth had already proven their worth. The clothing, the food, the seasonal movements, and the clear, though flexible, social layers had allowed the Persians to absorb new lands while keeping their own identity intact. The same barley porridge that had fed the clans in the 550s BCE now sustained the garrisons on the Jaxartes River. The wool cloaks that had kept horsemen warm on the plateau now protected patrols in the high passes of Gandhara. These continuities gave the growing empire a steady center that no amount of conquest alone could have created. Darius, reviewing the eastern reports, saw how the early patterns of work and rest continued to shape the realm. The king, who had once lived among the tribes, as a young noble now ruled a territory that stretched across continents. Yet the daily habits of the Iranian heartland remained the quiet source of its strength. The empire continued to expand its reach, drawing on the same practical wisdom that had guided the first unions of the clans. The life that had sustained Cyrus's people through the years of rapid growth had become the enduring core around which everything else was organized. The death of Cyrus, with the eastern satrapies now contributing their horses and grain to the central stores, the court at Pasargade turned its attention to securing the farthest reaches of the frontier against groups that still moved freely beyond the Jaxartes River. Reports from the new governors described how the Massageet, a nomadic people skilled in horsemanship and living in felt tents across the open grasslands, had begun crossing the boundary in small bands to take livestock and disrupt caravan traffic. Cyrus, in his 50s and still active in the daily oversight of the realm, decided to lead a force himself to settle the matter once and for all. He spent the winter of 531 to 530 BCE reviewing maps drawn by the scouts who had returned from the earlier expeditions and consulting with the clan leaders who knew the steppe country from past patrols. Preparations moved forward in the early spring. Supplies of barley and dried meat were loaded onto pack animals at the highland. Depots and additional cavalry units from the Persian and Median clans were called up. Cyrus chose a route that followed the established roads as far as the last way station, then struck northeast across the drier plains, where water sources were fewer. The army numbered several thousand horsemen and a smaller contingent of foot soldiers equipped with bows and short spears. Messengers rode ahead to the border, sat traps with instructions to gather local guides familiar with the seasonal grazing paths of the Massageet. The king himself rode at the head of the column, stopping each evening to check on the condition of the men and animals, and to listen to reports from the forward scouts. The march took several weeks as the force left the more settled valleys and entered the open country, where the grass grew shorter and the rivers ran lower in the summer heat. Cyrus made camp at a point near the Jaxartes, where the water could be forded at certain times of day. From there, he sent envoys across the river under a flag of truce to offer the Massageet terms. The proposal was simple. The nomads would recognize the Persian boundary, refrain from raids, and receive annual gifts of cloth and metal tools in exchange for allowing safe passage of caravans. The Massageet, led by their queen Tomis, rejected the offer outright. Their reply, carried back by the envoys, stated that they had no need for Persian goods and preferred to keep their freedom of movement as their ancestors had done. Cyrus chose to cross the river anyway. He divided the army into 3 parts so that one could guard the supply line, while the other two advanced in parallel to cover more ground. The first encounters were small skirmishes along the riverbanks, where Masagati scouts tested the Persian lines with quick arrow volleys before wheeling away. Cyrus ordered his men to hold formation and not pursue too far, conserving energy for larger actions. As the weeks passed, the Persians established several temporary camps deeper in the steppe, each one supplied by a chain of riders bringing grain from the rear. The nomads avoided direct battle at first, preferring to harass the edges of the camps at night and drive off stray horses. Cyrus responded by strengthening the picket lines and sending out larger patrols that gradually pushed the Massageet bands farther from the river. By midsummer, the main force of the Massageet had gathered under Queen Tamaris and moved to confront the intruders. The two sides met on a broad plain where the grass had been grazed short by the passing herds. Cyrus arranged his cavalry in a wide front with archers positioned to provide covering fire. The nomads attacked in their usual style, charging in loose groups and then retreating to draw the Persians out. Cyrus held his line steady and used the disciplined volleys to inflict losses without breaking formation. After several hours, the Massageet withdrew, leaving the field to the Persians. Cyrus did not press the pursuit immediately, choosing instead to rest the horses and tend to the wounded. He sent a second offer of terms, again carried under truce, but received the same refusal. The campaign continued through the late summer months. Smaller engagements occurred along the edges of the grazing lands, each one adding to the Persian knowledge of the terrain. Cyrus made notes on the locations of reliable wells and the best routes for moving supplies. He also began planning the placement of new outposts that could be manned by mixed garrisons of Persian soldiers and local allies once the fighting ended. The army remained in good order, with regular rotations of men back to the river camps for rest and resupply. News of the progress reached the western provinces through the messenger system, and the court at Pasargade continued its routine business of reviewing tribute lists and road repairs. In one of the final engagements, the Massageet launched a larger, coordinated effort, attack at dawn, catching part of the Persian camp before the lines were fully formed. Fighting was close and lasted through the morning. Cyrus positioned himself with the main body of cavalry and directed the counterattack that eventually drove the nomads back. During the action, his horse stumbled in the uneven ground, and he was thrown. Before his guards could reach him, a group of Massageet riders closed in. In the confusion of the melee, he received a mortal wound. His companions fought their way to him and carried him from the field as the Persians regained control of the ground. The Massageet, having suffered heavy losses themselves, did not press their advantage and withdrew to their own camps. Cyrus lingered for several days in the command tent, tended by the physicians who had accompanied the expedition. He gave clear instructions for the army to hold its position and for the succession to pass without delay to his elder son, Cambyses. Messengers were sent back along the supply line with the news so that the court could begin making arrangements. When death came, the body was prepared according to the customs of the Iranian plateau and placed in a simple wooden coffin for the long journey home. The army broke camp and began the march westward, moving in stages to avoid exhausting the remaining horses and to keep the supply trains intact. Along the route, the men stopped at the way stations they had used on the outward journey, and local headmen came out to pay respects as the procession passed. Word of the king's death reached Pasargade ahead of the column. The nobles gathered in the halls Cyrus had built and confirmed Cambyses as the new ruler according to the plans the father had made years earlier. No major unrest followed. The clans that had supported Cyrus accepted the transition because Cambyses had already been given responsibilities in the western provinces and was known to the army. The body arrived after several weeks of careful travel, and the burial took place in the stone tomb that had been prepared on a low platform in the gardens of Pasargade. The structure was modest, a single chamber with a gabled roof and no elaborate carvings, surrounded by the trees and water channels the king had planted himself. Offerings of barley and wine were placed inside, according to tradition, and the Magi kept the sacred fire burning nearby for the required period. Cambyses took up the reins of government at once. He confirmed the governors in their posts and sent messengers to every satrapy announcing the change of rule while assuring them that the existing agreements on tribute and local customs would remain in force. The eastern frontier was stabilized by leaving a garrison at the last outpost on the Jaxartes and by renewing the gifts to those Massageet bands that had indicated a willingness to trade rather than fight. The nomads, having lost their most active raiders in the final battle, accepted the new boundary for the time being and returned to their seasonal movements farther north. The empire that Cyrus left behind stretched from the Aeon coast to the Indus River and from the southern deserts to the steppes. Beyond the Caspian, it was still held together more by personal loyalties and the roads he had improved than by a fully developed bureaucracy. Satraps in distant lands operated with considerable independence. As long as the annual tribute arrived and order was kept, the army remained centered on the Persian and Median cavalry, with contingents from the subject peoples added as needed. Trade continued along the protected routes, carrying grain from Babylonia, gold from Lydia, and spices from the eastern satrapies. Farmers in the Iranian valleys planted their barley each spring, and the seasonal movements of the herds went on as they had for generations. Cambyses faced the immediate task of consolidating what his father had gained. He spent the first months after the burial traveling between Pasargade and Epatana, meeting with the clan leaders and reviewing the lists of resources that had been collected under Cyrus. He made no sudden changes to the administrative arrangements, preferring instead to let the existing governors prove their reliability. Messengers continued to ride the roads, carrying reports and instructions in the same manner that had served the previous reign. The court maintained its practice of consulting with advisors from different regions before making major decisions, and the policy of allowing local customs to continue was upheld without interruption. News of Cyrus's death spread gradually through the provinces. In Babylon, the priests noted the event in their temple records and continued the daily offerings without pause. In the western coastal cities, merchants adjusted their caravan schedules, but saw no break in the safe passage that had been guaranteed. In the eastern valleys, farmers harvested their millet and paid their share to the SAT trappers before. The transition felt steady rather than abrupt because the structures Cyrus had put in place over 30 years were already functioning on their own momentum. Cambyses ordered that work continue on the roads and way stations that had been started in the later years of his father's rule. He also confirmed the arrangements for the repair of canals in Mesopotamia and the collection of tribute from Egypt. These practical steps helped reassure the distant governors that the central authority remained intact. At the same time, he began preparing for his own first major undertaking, the extension of Persian control into the Nile Valley, which would occupy much of the next decade. For now, the focus remained on maintaining the peace that Cyrus had established across the wide territory. The tomb at Pasargade became a place where travelers stopped to pay respects when they passed through the southern valleys. The simple stone chamber stood quietly among the gardens, a reminder of the shepherd leader who had built the realm from the clans of the plateau. No grand processions or public ceremonies marked the site in the years immediately after the burial. Instead, the Magi tended the fire, and the local families left small offerings of grain or cloth when they moved their herds nearby. The empire continued its daily rhythms with barley fields ripening under the summer sun and caravans moving along the roads that linked the distant provinces. Cambyses ruled with the same attention to fair dealing that had guided his father. Though his style was shaped by the new challenges of a larger and more complex territory, the loosely organized realm that Cyrus had left required careful management to keep the tribute flowing and the borders secure. The king's death in the eastern grasslands had closed one chapter, but the institutions and habits he had fostered over 3 decades provided the foundation for what would follow. The Persian lands remained united under the new ruler, and the work of expansion and consolidation moved forward without the disruptions that might have occurred in a less carefully built domain. As the 520s BCE began, the court settled into its routine once more. Governors sent their regular reports, roads were maintained, and the seasonal cycles of planting and harvesting continued across the plateau. The vast territory gathered by Cyrus now waited to be shaped more firmly by his successor. Yet the core strength of the realm endured in the loyalty of the clans and the steady flow of resources along the protected routes. The final campaign against the Massageti had secured the frontier at a high cost, but it had also demonstrated the reach and resilience of the empire that Cyrus had created. The body in the quiet tomb at Pasargade rested amid the gardens he had known, while the realm he left behind entered its next phase under the guidance of his son Cambyses, and the conquest of Egypt. The 520s BCE opened with the court settled into its routines at Pasargade and Ecbatana. Cambyses worked steadily to keep the empire running smoothly after his father's passing. He confirmed the existing governors in their positions across the provinces and made sure the messenger system continued to deliver regular reports from every district. Tribute shipments arrived on schedule from the western satraps, and the eastern frontier and the roads that Cyrus had improved remained in good repair. Cambyses spent much of his time traveling between the main centers, meeting with clan leaders and reviewing the lists of grain stores and cavalry units. He understood that the realm was still held together by the personal loyalties his father had built, so he kept the same balance between Persian and Median nobles that had served so well. The one unfinished task that Cyrus had left was the extension of Persian authority into Egypt. The Nile Valley had long been a wealthy land with its own strong traditions, and its rulers had sometimes supported smaller states in the Levant that now looked to Persia for protection. Cambyses decided to prepare a campaign that would bring the region under direct control. He began by gathering supplies at the Phoenician ports, where shipbuilders from the coastal cities assembled a fleet of vessels to carry troops and grain along the Mediterranean coast. Additional forces were drawn from the Greek cities in Anatolia and from the Babylonian districts, where local officials provided boats and crews familiar with river navigation. The main army assembled gradually over several years, with Persian and Median cavalry forming the core and foot soldiers recruited from the settled provinces. By the spring of 525 BCE, everything was ready. Cambyses led the force south along the coastal road, crossing the Sinai Desert with the help of Arab guides who knew the waterholes and provided camels for transport. The army moved in stages to keep the men and animals fit, stopping at oases where fresh supplies had been arranged in advance. When they reached the border of Egypt, the Persian force met the army of the Egyptian king Psammetichus III near the town of Pelusium. The Egyptians had gathered their own troops and hired Greek mercenaries to strengthen their lines. The battle that followed was a hard day of fighting, with the Persians using disciplined archers and mobile cavalry to break through the Egyptian formations. By evening, the Egyptian army had withdrawn, and the Delta region lay open. Cambyses advanced without delay toward the ancient capital at Memphis. The city surrendered after a short period of resistance. Cambyses entered Memphis in a formal procession and made a point of visiting the main temples to show respect for the local gods. He allowed the priests to continue their daily rites and confirmed many Egyptian officials in their posts. The conquest brought the fertile lands along the Nile into the empire, adding a reliable source of grain that could support the growing needs of the provinces farther north. Trade routes through the Red Sea became safer under Persian oversight, and harbors along the coast saw increased traffic from Phoenician and Greek merchants. Cambyses spent the next several months in Egypt, learning about the systems of irrigation and record-keeping that had sustained the country for centuries. He appointed a Persian governor to oversee the satrapy, but left day-to-day affairs largely in the hands of local nobles who had demonstrated loyalty. Farmers along the Nile continued to plant their crops according to the annual flood cycle, paying their taxes in grain or labor as they had under their own kings. The change in rule brought little disruption to ordinary life. Temples received support for repairs where needed, and the traditional festivals went on without interruption. Cambyses adopted some of the titles and practices of an Egyptian ruler, which helped the priests and officials accept the new authority. This approach followed the same pattern of tolerance that Cyrus had established elsewhere, and it helped keep the province calm during the early years of Persian control. While Cambyses was occupied in the south, reports from the Iranian plateau began to arrive with notes of growing unease. Some nobles felt that the king had been away too long and that the burdens of supplying the army had fallen unevenly on certain districts. Others whispered about decisions made in Egypt that seemed to favor local customs over Persian traditions. Cambyses addressed these concerns by sending messengers with clear instructions to the governors, reminding them that the existing agreements on tribute would remain in force and that the court expected regular deliveries as before. He also ordered that additional way stations be built along the roads leading south so that communications could move more quickly. Back in Egypt, Cambyses continued to strengthen the administration. He ordered surveys of the farmland along the canals to set fair tax levels that would not strain the farmers. New storehouses were constructed near the main river ports to hold the royal share of the harvest, and local Egyptian crews were placed in charge of them. The arrangement ensured that the grain shipments northward continued steadily, while giving the people a sense that their own neighbors were involved in the process. Merchants in the delta ports noticed that Persian protection reduced the risk of raids from desert bands, and trade in linen and papyrus increased as a result. As the months passed, Cambyses turned his attention to the western parts of Egypt and the oases that lay beyond the Nile Valley. Small detachments were sent to secure these areas and to make sure the trade routes remained set open. The work was done quietly with minimal fighting, and the local leaders were confirmed in their positions once they agreed to the standard terms of tribute and loyalty. The king used the time to consult with Egyptian scribes about their methods of tracking the seasons and the flood levels, information that could be useful for planning future campaigns elsewhere in the empire. By the early months of 522 BCE, Cambyses had spent nearly 3 years in Egypt and felt the province was stable enough for him to turn his attention back toward the center of the realm. He appointed a trusted governor to remain in Memphis and gave him instructions to continue the policy of working through local officials. The king then began the journey northward with a smaller escort, planning to stop in the Levant and Babylonia to review the satrapies along the way. The march proceeded steadily at first, with the columns moving through familiar territory and stopping at the way stations that had been improved during the earlier preparations. As the group approached the border regions, however, messengers arrived with more urgent news from the Iranian heartland. Unrest had broken out in several provinces, and a man claiming to be Cambyses' younger brother, Bardia, had declared himself king. The report suggested that many people had accepted the claim because the real Bardia had been kept out of public view for some time. Cambyses quickened the pace of his return, sending riders ahead to gather more details and to reassure the loyal governors that he was on his way. The journey continued through the spring, with the king stopping only briefly to consult with local officials and to make sure the roads remained clear. During this northward march, Cambyses fell ill. The exact nature of the illness is not recorded in detail, but it worsened steadily as the column moved through the upland districts. He gave final instructions to his closest companions, naming Darius as one of the nobles who could be trusted to maintain order until the succession was settled. Cambyses died in the spring of 522 BCE, probably somewhere in the region between Syria and the Zagros Mountains. His body was prepared for transport and carried back toward Pasargadae, while the escort continued to send messengers to keep the court informed. The death of Cambyses left the empire without a clear ruler for a short period. The false later identified in official records as Galata had already taken control of several centers in Media and Persia. He called some taxes and tried to win support from the common people by promising relief from the demands of the previous years. Many accepted his rule at first, especially in districts that had felt the strain of supporting the Egyptian campaign. The core of the Persian nobility, however, remained suspicious because they knew the real Bardia had been sent on a mission earlier and had not been seen for a long time. News of Cambyses' death reached the western provinces in Egypt through the same road network that had carried his orders. Governors there continued their work according to the instructions they had received, keeping the tribute flowing and the local administrations running. In Egypt, the governor appointed by Cambyses maintained the policy of respect for the temples and the use of Egyptian officials. So the province remained calm, even as uncertainty spread in the heartland. Grain shipments continued northward without interruption, and the farmers along the Nile went about their seasonal tasks as before. The brief reign of Cambyses had extended the empire into North Africa and added the wealth of the Nile to the resources already gathered by Cyrus. The conquest had been achieved with relatively little destruction, and the administrative arrangements he left in place allowed the province to function as a working satrapy. At the same time, the years away from the center had created strains that would require careful handling by whoever took the throne next. The empire had grown larger, yet the challenge of holding it together under a single authority remained. The roads still carried reports and tribute. The seasonal cycles of planting and harvesting continued on the plateau, and the people in the distant provinces waited to see how the succession would be resolved. Cambyses had carried forward his father's work of expansion, and the structures he put in place in Egypt would serve the realm for years to come, even as the court in the highlands faced the immediate task of restoring order. A crisis of succession after Cambyses died on the road north in the spring of 522 BCE. The empire entered a period of uncertainty that tested the arrangements left by both Cyrus and his son. The false Bardia who had taken control of several key centers in Media and Persia, continued to issue orders from the old Median capital at Ekbatana. He reduced certain taxes in the Iranian districts and promised relief to farmers who had supplied the Egyptian campaign. Many ordinary people in the highlands accepted these measures because they brought immediate ease after years of supporting distant armies. Local headmen in the villages collected the lower payments and sent reports back to Ekbatana, where the new ruler confirmed their positions and distributed small gifts of cloth and grain to secure loyalty. The administration in the western provinces in Egypt continued to function because the governors there had clear instructions from Cambyses and saw no reason to change course until clearer news arrived from the center. The core Persian nobles, however, grew increasingly doubtful. They remembered that the real Bardia had been sent away on a private mission sometime earlier and had not returned. Messengers traveling between the provinces carried quiet questions about the identity of the man now giving orders. Darius, who had served as a spear-bearer in Cambyses' guard and came from a junior branch of the Achaemenid family, to gather information from trusted companions. He moved carefully through the highlands, speaking with clan leaders he had known since his youth and comparing the reports that reached him from different districts. The picture that emerged showed that the man at Ekbatana was not the true son of Cyrus, but an impostor who had taken advantage of the confusion following Cambyses' death. By late summer of 522 BCE, Darius had assembled a small group of 7 noble companions who shared his concerns. They met in secret at a location away from the main roads, reviewing the evidence and planning their next steps. The group included men from leading Persian families who commanded their own cavalry units and had served in the earlier campaigns. They agreed that action was necessary to prevent the empire from splitting along the old lines of Persian and Median rivalry. Darius proposed that they ride directly to the palace compound where the false ruler was staying and remove him before larger unrest could spread. The plan was simple and swift. Enter under the cover of a routine audience, confront the claimant, and restore the legitimate line. In September 522 BCE, the small band approached the palace at Ekbatana. They gained entry by claiming they carried urgent messages from the western satrapies. Once inside the inner chambers, they drew their weapons and killed the false, along with his closest supporters. The body was displayed publicly so that the guards and officials could see the man they had followed was not the real prince. Darius then addressed the assembled nobles and army officers, explaining what had happened and declaring that the Achaemenid line must continue through the rightful heir. Many accepted his account immediately because they had already harbored doubts, and the swift action prevented any prolonged fighting inside the compound. The news of the coup spread quickly along the roads. Some provinces welcomed the change because they preferred a ruler from the established Persian line. Others hesitated, waiting to see whether the new authority would hold. Within weeks, revolts broke out in several distant regions. In Babylon, a man named Ninu Bel claimed descent from the old Babylonian royal house and gathered support among those who remembered the days before Persian rule. He seized control of the city and began issuing orders in the name of the ancient kings. Similar uprisings appeared in Media, where a leader named Phraortes declared himself a descendant of the old Median rulers and called on the mountain tribes to join him. In the eastern satrapies and parts of the west, local governors or tribal chiefs tried to break away or install their own candidates. The empire that had grown so rapidly under Cyrus and Cambyses now faced the danger of fragmenting into its separate pieces. Darius responded without delay. He divided the available forces among his trusted companions and sent each group to a different trouble spot while he himself marched against the Babylonian rebel. The column moved south along the improved roads, stopping at the way stations for fresh horses and supplies. When they reached the Tigris River, Darius found Nidin Tubal's army drawn up on the opposite bank. The Persians crossed at a ford during the night and attacked at first light. The fighting was sharp, but lasted only a few hours. The Babylonian forces broke, and Nidin was captured shortly afterward. Darius entered Babylon in a calm procession, visited the main temple to offer respect to Marduk, and confirmed the local officials who had not joined the revolt. The city returned to its normal routines within days, with markets reopening and grain deliveries resuming according to the earlier agreements. Similar actions took place in Media. One of Darius's companions led a force into the Zagros Mountains and defeated Phraortes after several months of hard fighting in the passes. The rebel leader was brought before Darius, executed, but the ordinary tribesmen were allowed to return to their villages once they swore loyalty. In the eastern provinces, other commanders put down smaller uprisings by moving quickly along the frontier roads and offering terms to those who surrendered early. Each success was reported back to the center, and Darius used the information to adjust his plans for the remaining districts. By the middle of 521 BCE, most of the major revolts had been suppressed, though scattered resistance continued in a few remote areas. The experience of these months showed Darius the weaknesses in the loose structure he had inherited. Governors in distant satrapies had sometimes acted on their own when news from the center was slow or unclear. Tribute collections had become irregular in places where local leaders saw an opportunity to keep more for themselves. Roads that had been well maintained under Cyrus and Cambyses now needed repairs in several stretches because fighting had damaged bridges and way stations. Darius began making notes on these problems while the last revolts were still being settled. He consulted with experienced officials from Babylon and the western provinces, asking how their systems had functioned before Persian rule and what parts could be adapted for the larger empire. During this same period, Darius strengthened his claim to the throne by marrying Atossa, a daughter of Cyrus. The marriage linked his own line more closely with the founder and helped reassure the nobles who had supported Cyrus from the beginning. He also made sure that the main Persian clans received positions at court and commands in the army so that their loyalty remained firm. At the same time, he kept a careful watch on the Median families to prevent any renewed push for greater independence. The balance between the two peoples continued, but now it was guided more directly from the center. By the end of 521 BCE, the immediate crisis had passed. The empire remained intact, though shaken. Darius had shown that he could act decisively in battle and in the palace, yet he understood that military success alone would not hold the vast territory together. The revolts had revealed the need for clearer lines of authority, more reliable systems of taxation, and faster communication across the provinces. He spent the winter months reviewing the lists of resources from every satrapy and planning how to reorganize the administration so that future uncertainties could be met with steadier control. The roads that had carried armies during the fighting would soon carry inspectors and messengers on regular circuits. The storehouses that had supplied the campaigns would be used to hold fixed tribute collected according to written agreements. The people in the provinces noticed the return of order gradually. Farmers in the Babylonian countryside resumed planting their fields once the rebel forces had been cleared. Merchants in the western coastal cities reopened their warehouses when the roads became safe again. Herders on the Iranian plateau moved their flocks to winter pastures without fear of sudden demands from passing armies. The crisis of succession had been short but sharp, and its resolution left Darius with both the authority and the practical knowledge he needed to begin reshaping the empire into a more durable structure. The work of rebuilding would occupy the next several years, but the foundation had been secured through swift action and careful attention to the lessons of the recent months. Cambyses' death and the brief rule of the impostor had tested the empire's cohesion. Yet the core territories had held. The roads still connected the distant lands. The seasonal cycles of agriculture continued, and the loyalty of the main Persian and Median clans provided the steady center from which Darius could now build. The crisis had ended, and the long task of turning a collection of conquered lands into a functioning imperial system was about to begin in earnest. Darius takes the throne with the last pockets of resistance cleared by the end of 521 BCE. Darius moved to make his position as king permanent and visible across the entire realm. He returned to the main centers in the Iranian highlands and called together the nobles from the leading Persian and Median families. They gathered in the halls at Passover Day, where he explained the steps he had taken during the fighting and outlined the need for a single clear authority at the center. The assembly confirmed his right to rule by acclamation, and he distributed honors and land grants to those who had remained loyal through the difficult months. This gathering helped restore confidence among the clans that formed the army's backbone and set the tone for the years ahead. Darius wasted no time in addressing the remaining unrest. A few districts in the eastern satrapies still held out under local chiefs who had declared independence during the confusion. He sent smaller detachments along the frontier roads, each led by a trusted companion who carried written orders and royal seals. These forces moved quickly, offering amnesty to any who laid down their arms and delivering swift justice to those who continued to fight. By the spring of 520 BCE, either last rebel leaders had been captured or driven beyond the borders, and regular tribute deliveries resumed from every province. The roads that had carried armies now carried caravans once more, and the way set. Stations were restocked with grain for messengers rather than soldiers. To mark the end of the troubles, and to explain what had happened to people who spoke many different languages, Darius ordered a large inscription carved on the rock face at Behistun. The site lay along the main road from Babylon to Epatana, where travelers from every corner of the empire would pass. Teams of stonemasons and scribes arrived in the summer of 520 BCE and began work on a high cliff that could be seen from the prior set highway below. The text was written in three scripts: the old Elumite used in the western provinces, the Babylonian uniform familiar to the riverlands, and the new Persian uniform that Darius had helped develop for official use. The words told the story of how the impostor had been removed and how the 9 rebel kings had been defeated one after another. Darius described each victory in simple factual terms, naming the leaders, the places, and the months when the fighting ended. The carving set showed Darius standing with his foot on the chest of the false Bardia, while the other rebels stood before him in chains. Sculptors from different regions worked together on the figures so that the style blended elements from Babylonian reliefs and Iranian metal work. When the work was finished, copies of the text were made on clay tablets and leather scrolls and sent to every satrapy. Local scribes read the versions aloud in town squares and temple courts so that even those who could not read could hear the king's account. The inscription served as both a record and a warning. The empire had one ruler, and challenges to his authority would be met with the same firmness that had ended the revolts. With the Behistun text completed, Darius turned to the practical task of rebuilding the administration that had been strained during the fighting. He reviewed the lists of governors who had stayed loyal and replaced those who had wavered. Each new satrap received a written document setting out his exact duties, the amount of tribute his province must send each year, and the number of troops he must provide when called. Royal inspectors, known as the king's eyes and ears, were appointed to travel the roads on a regular schedule. They carried their own seals and reported directly to Darius, bypassing the local governors when necessary. This system made sure that information reached the center quickly and that no single official could act without oversight. The roads themselves received attention next. Crews repaired bridges damaged during the revolts and widened certain stretches so that larger caravans could pass without delay. New way stations were built at intervals of a day's ride, each one equipped with fresh horses, grain stores, and a small guard. Messengers could now travel from the Indus to the Aoan coast in a matter of weeks rather than months. Darius also standardized the weights and measures used for tribute so that a sack of grain from Babylon held the same amount as one from Egypt. Merchants noticed the change immediately because disputes over quantities became rare and trade along the protected routes grew steadily. In the Iranian heartland, Darius made sure the cavalry units that had fought for him received pasture lands and shares of the royal herds. Young men from the clans continued their training with bow and lance, but now they practiced under officers who had served in the recent campaigns and could teach the lessons learned on the Tigris and in the Zagros passes. The seasonal movements of the flocks went on as before, yet the herders knew that the king's inspectors would check the royal share of wool and meat each autumn. This balance kept the plateau strong without overburdening the families who had always supplied the empire's horsemen. Darius also began to plan for new royal centers that would serve as visible seats of power. He chose a site in the southern Persian valleys near the old city of Pasargadae, but on a higher terrace that offered a clear view of the surrounding plains. Work crews started clearing the ground and quarrying stone from nearby hills. Artisans from Egypt and Babylon were brought in to advise on foundations and drainage, while Persian carpenters directed the framing of the first halls. The buildings were designed to be spacious and open to the mountain breezes rather than cramped like the older fortress cities. Darius visited the site whenever his travels allowed, walking among the workmen and asking questions about the stonework and the water channels that would supply the gardens. The policy of allowing local customs to continue remained in force, but now it was backed by clearer records. In Egypt, the priests continued to manage their temples and record the flood levels, as they had for centuries. Yet, they sent copies of their accounts to the satrap in Memphis. In Babylon, the scribes kept their ununiform records of temple offerings and canal repairs, but they also prepared summaries in Aramaic that the royal inspectors could read without translation. These small adjustments made the central government feel less distant without changing the daily life of ordinary people. Farmers along the Nile still planted their fields according to the flood, and merchants in Sardis still wore their fine wool. But now, both knew that their contributions helped support the larger system that kept the road safe. Darius spent the winter of 520 to 519 BCE, moving between Ekbatana and the new building site, reviewing reports and adjusting plans. He ordered that the annual tribute from each satrapy be delivered to specific collection points so that the amounts could be checked against the written agreements. Any shortfalls were noted and discussed with the governor rather than punished immediately. Giving honest officials a chance to explain unusual conditions such as poor harvests or locust damage, this practical flexibility helped maintain goodwill while still ensuring a steady flow of resources to the center. By the middle of 519 BCE, the empire had settled into a new rhythm. The revolts were a memory recorded forever on the rock at Behistun for travelers to see. The roads carried regular traffic. The inspectors made their circuits, and the SAT traps sent their reports on schedule. Darius had taken the throne in a moment of crisis and held it through action and organization. The nobleman, who had once carried a spear in Cambyses' guard, now ruled a territory stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, and he was turning that territory into a single functioning whole. The work of the next years would build on this foundation, but the throne was secure, and the lessons of 522 and 521 BCE had been turned into lasting institutions. The people in the villages and towns noticed the change in small ways. A caravan driver stopping at a way station found fresh horses ready without extra payment. A village headman in Media delivered his share of wool and received a receipt that protected him from later demands. A priest in a Babylonian temple offered the daily rites, knowing that the king's representatives would attend the major festivals without interfering. These quiet assurances spread through the provinces and helped the empire recover its strength after the difficult months of uncertainty. Darius continued to travel among his people, listening to reports and making adjustments as needed, always keeping the balance between central authority and local practice that had served the realm so well from its earliest days. The inscription at Behistun stood as a permanent reminder of how the throne had been secured. Travelers paused to look at the carved figures and to hear the text read aloud. The story it told was not one of endless glory, but of order restored after confusion, of 9 kings defeated and a single ruler confirmed. Darius had used the rock, the roads, and the written word to bind the empire together more firmly than before. Nobleman, who had seized power in 522 BCE had become the king who would shape the Persian realm for the next generation. And the work begun in those years would support everything that followed, rebuilding order after. The Behistun inscription had been completed and the last rebel leaders removed. Darius turned his full attention to restoring steady government across every province. He spent the years from 519 to 517 BCE, traveling between the main centers and meeting with SAT traps who had remained loyal during the crisis. Each meeting followed the same calm pattern. The governor presented written lists of what his district had produced in grain, silver, horses, and men for the army. Darius compared these figures against the agreements made earlier and noted any shortfalls or surpluses. Where a province had suffered from fighting or poor weather, he adjusted the next year's demand downward and recorded the reason so that future inspectors would understand the change. This method prevented resentment and kept the flow of resources moving without constant threats. In Media, the mountain districts that had supported Phraortes needed special care. Darius replaced the governor with a man from a trusted Persian family and ordered repairs to the roads that crossed the Zagros passes. Crews cleared fallen rock and rebuilt small bridges so that caravans could move safely again. Local headmen were called to meetings where they received new seals confirming their right to collect taxes from their own villages. In return, they agreed to send accurate counts of their herds each autumn. The arrangement worked because the tribes kept their traditional grazing rights and only the royal share went to the center. Within 2 seasons, the wool and meat deliveries from Media reached their proper levels again. Babylonia required different attention. The canals that had been neglected during the revolt had allowed salt water to damage some fields. Darius ordered teams of local engineers to clear the silt and strengthen the embankments. Labor was drawn from the surrounding villages, with each community providing a set number of workers for a fixed period. The work was paid in grain from the royal stores so that families did not go hungry while repairing the land that fed them. By the harvest of 518 BCE, the improved canals carried water farther into the fields, and the barley crop increased enough to cover both local needs and the tribute owed to the king. The Babylonian scribes recorded the repairs in their own script and sent summaries to the royal archives. In the western provinces, the Greek coastal cities had stayed quiet during the succession troubles, yet some had delayed their silver payments. Darius sent a trusted inspector with a small escort to review the accounts in Sardis. The inspector met with city leaders and explained the fixed amounts that had been agreed under Cyrus and Cambyses. After checking the workshops and harbor records, he confirmed most of the earlier arrangements, but raised the payments slightly for cities that had grown richer from trade. The leaders accepted the change because the roads were now safer and the Persian garrisons kept pirates away from the Aegean coast. Trade in dyed wool and olive oil increased as a result, and the extra silver helped pay for the new building projects in the south. The eastern satraps presented their own challenges. The Bactrian valleys and the lands near the Indus had supplied horses during the revolts, but some frontier forts had been damaged. Darius ordered fresh timber from the northern forests to repair the walls and stockades. New garrisons were placed at the main river crossings, with soldiers drawn from both Persian units and local tribes who had shown loyalty. These mixed forces patrolled the trade routes and made sure that caravans carrying gold dust and ivory reached the collection points without loss. The satrap in Gandhara received instructions to keep records in Aramaic so that reports could be read quickly at court. Within a year, the eastern tribute resumed its steady flow and the frontier felt secure again. Darius also addressed the army itself. Many units had been scattered during the fighting, and some men had not returned to their home districts. He ordered a review of all cavalry and infantry companies. Officers who had performed well received promotions and shares of land on the plateau. Those who had wavered were quietly replaced. Training continued in the highland pastures, with emphasis on the lessons learned in the Tigris crossing and the Zagros passes. Young horsemen practiced riding in formation and shooting arrows while moving, skills that had proven useful against both rebel armies and nomadic raiders. The royal herds supplied fresh mounts, and the grain stores from Babylonia and Egypt fed the men during the training seasons. To improve the speed of government, Das expanded the messenger service. Each way station along the main roads now kept at least 10 fresh horses and enough grain for riders who might arrive at any hour. Messengers carried lightweight tablets or leather scrolls and changed mounts every 20 meters so they could cover long distances without rest. A letter from the Indus could reach Susa in under 2 weeks, and news from Egypt arrived within a month. This speed allowed Darius to respond to small problems before they grew large. When a governor in the west reported low Nile floods, the king reduced the grain demand for that year and sent extra barley from Babylonian stores to prevent hardship. At the same time, Darius worked to make justice more consistent. He appointed royal judges who traveled with the inspectors and heard cases that crossed provincial boundaries. A dispute between a Phoenician merchant and a Median landowner was settled according to the customs of both parties, with the judge making sure neither side lost unfairly. Smaller matters stayed in local hands. Village elders in the Iranian valleys continued to decide grazing rights as they had always done, and temple courts in Babylon handled everyday contracts. The combination of local practice and royal oversight reduced complaints and kept communities working together. The rebuilding years also brought small improvements to daily life in many districts. In Egypt, the governor used part of the local tribute to repair several smaller temples that had suffered during the earlier campaigns. Priests recorded the work in their annals and continued the daily offerings without change. Along the royal road in Anatolia, new wells were dug at dry stretches so that travelers and their animals could drink without long detours. Farmers in the river plains planted extra fields because they knew the tax level would stay fixed and the roads would carry their surplus to market safely. These quiet gains accumulated slowly, strengthening the provinces without any dramatic announcements. Darius kept careful personal records of everything. Each evening when he was at court, he reviewed the latest lists from the satrapies and made notes in his own hand about adjustments for the following season. He consulted with older officials who had served under Cyrus, asking how certain districts had been managed in the early years. This habit of steady review became part of the way the empire functioned. No major new conquests were launched during these years. Instead, the focus remained on repairing damage, tightening administration, and making sure every province contributed according to its ability. By the end of 517 BCE, the realm had regained its balance. Tribute flowed on schedule, roads were in better repair, and the army stood ready, but was not constantly on campaign. The revolts of 522 and 521 BCE had been costly. Yet, they had taught Darius exactly where the weaknesses lay. He had used the years since then to fix those weaknesses with practical measures rather than sweeping changes that might have caused new unrest. The king who had seized the throne in a swift action now ruled through steady organization and attention to detail. The people across the empire felt the return of order in their daily routines. A herder in the Zagros moved his flock to summer pasture, knowing the royal share would be taken fairly at the usual time. A boatman on the Euphrates carried grain to the collection point and received a receipt that protected him from extra demands. A merchant in Mytus loaded his ship with olive oil and sailed under Persian protection without fear of sudden taxes or piracy. These small certainties spread through every province and helped the vast territory settle into a working whole. Darius continued to travel among his lands, stopping at the building site in the south and at the main centers in Media and Babylon. He listened to reports, adjusted instructions, and made sure the systems he was creating would outlast any single reign. The work of rebuilding order had taken several quiet years, but by 517 BCE it was largely complete. The empire that had nearly fractured after Cambyses' death now stood stronger and more clearly organized than before. The foundation was ready for the larger administrative and building projects that would define Darius's long rule, the satrapy system. With the empire now steady again, by the end of 517 BCE, Darius began the work of dividing the entire territory into a clear set of provinces that could be managed from the center, without constant personal travel. He spent months reviewing the lists of resources that had come in from every district during the rebuilding years. These records showed exactly what each region produced best, how many people lived there, and what kind of terrain it contained. Using that information, he organized the realm into 20 satraps, each one large enough to be important, yet small enough for a single governor to oversee effectively. The boundaries followed natural features such as rivers, and mountain ranges whenever possible, so that local leaders could understand where their responsibilities began and ended. Darius chose the governors or satraps almost entirely from the trusted Persian and Median noble families. Each satrap received a formal document that listed his exact duties. He was to collect the fixed tribute set for his province, maintain order among the local population, and provide a set number of troops for the royal army when called upon. The satrap lived in the main city of his province and kept a small court of his own, but he answered directly to the king through regular written reports. In Babylonia, the satrap worked from the old palace in the city itself, while in Egypt he operated from Memphis. In the western coastal region, the satrap stayed at Sardis, and in the eastern river valleys he used a fortified town near the main trade crossing. This arrangement gave each governor enough authority to act quickly on local matters while keeping him tied to the central system. The tribute for each satrapy was now set at a fixed level based on the surveys carried out earlier. Babylonia and the surrounding riverlands sent large amounts of grain and silver because their fields and workshops produced more than most. Egypt contributed grain from the Nile Delta and certain amounts of linen and papyrus. The western provinces supplied gold from the old Lydian mines and timber from the northern forests. The eastern satraps sent horses from their pastures, and gold dust from the river sands. The Iranian heartland itself provided the cavalry horses and wool that had always formed its main contribution. Darius recorded each amount in the royal archives so that both the SAT trap and the inspectors could check the deliveries against the same figures every year. If a harvest failed because of unusual weather, the SAT trap could request a temporary reduction, but he had to explain the reason with evidence from local records. This system replaced the earlier loose arrangements with clear expectations that everyone could understand. To make sure the SAT traps carried out their duties honestly, Darius created a separate group of royal inspectors who answered only to him. These men, often called the king's eyes and ears, traveled the roads on a regular schedule. Each inspector carried a royal seal that allowed him to demand fresh horses at any way station and to examine the satrap's records without advance notice. They checked the tribute set stores, visited the local courts, and spoke directly with village headmen and temple officials. If they found that a satrap had collected more than the agreed amount or had failed to repair a bridge, they reported the matter straight to the court. The satrap could not punish an inspector or interfere with his work. This independent check kept the governors careful and gave ordinary people in the provinces a way to bring problems to the king's attention without going through the local official. The roads that linked the satraps received their most important improvements during these same years. Darius ordered the main highway from Sardis in the west all the way to Susa in the south to be widened and resurfaced along its entire length. Work crews from the nearby districts cleared stones, filled ruts, and built stronger bridges over the rivers. At intervals of roughly a day's ride, new way stations were completed with stables for 50 horses, storehouses for grain, and simple sleeping quarters for messengers and travelers. Each station had its own small staff, who received regular pay from the royal treasury. A rider carrying urgent reports could now change horses at each stop and cover the full distance from the Aegean coast to the Iranian plateau in less than 2 weeks. Secondary roads connecting the satrapy capitals to this main artery were also repaired so that tribute caravans and military units could move without delay. The satrapy system allowed Darius to remain at the center while still controlling distant lands. He spent most of his time in the highlands or at the growing building site in the south. Yet he received weekly reports from the inspectors and monthly summaries from the satraps. When a problem arose in one province, such as a dispute over water rights along a canal in Egypt, the king could send a single written order that reached the satrap within a month. The satrap then settled the matter according to local custom, but reported the outcome back to the court. This steady exchange of information turned the empire from a collection of loosely held territories into a single administrative body. Local life inside each satrapy continued much as it had before the new system. Farmers in the Nile Valley planted their crops according to the flood calendar and delivered their grain to the collection point set by the satrap. Merchants in the Greek coastal cities loaded their ships with olive oil and wine, paying the fixed harbor fee before sailing. Herders on the eastern grasslands moved their flocks to summer pastures and sent the required number of horses to the royal herds each autumn. The satrap did not interfere with these daily routines. He simply made sure the tribute left on schedule and that the roads stayed open for everyone. Temples kept their own priests and festivals, and village elders continued to settle small disputes among families. The new structure supported these local ways rather than replacing them. Darius also used the satrapies to organize the army more effectively. Each province was required to maintain a small permanent garrison and to supply additional troops for larger campaigns when needed. The SAT trap kept lists of the able-bodied men in his district and made sure they received basic training with bow and lance during the quieter months. When the king called for forces, the satrap could assemble his contingent quickly and send it along the improved roads to join the main army. This system meant that the royal forces no longer had to rely on sudden levies from the clans alone. The cavalry from the eastern satraps, for example, could reach the western coast in good time because the way stations provided fresh horses and grain along the route. The fixed tribute and the inspectors also brought a new steadiness to the royal treasury. Darius now knew in advance how much silver, grain, and other goods would arrive each season. He could plan the support for the building projects in the south and the maintenance of the roads without guessing. Any surplus from a good harvest was stored in central granaries near Susa and Pipolis so that it could be used in years when one province suffered a shortage. The satraps understood that honest collection and prompt delivery would earn them continued favor at court, while any attempt to keep extra tribute for themselves would be discovered by the traveling inspectors. By the middle of the 510s BCE, the satrapy system had settled into its working form. The 20 provinces functioned as connected parts of a larger whole, each contributing according to its strengths, and each watched by the same set of rules. Darius reviewed the annual summaries himself and made small adjustments when necessary, always explaining the reasons to the satraps so they could see the fairness of the decisions. The roads carried not only tribute and troops, but also the steady exchange of goods between satrapies. Grain from Egypt reached the Iranian plateau, while horses from the eastern grasslands served in the western garrisons. Merchants traveled more freely because they knew the rules at every stop along the way. The people in the villages and towns felt the benefits gradually. A farmer in Babylonia could plan his planting, knowing exactly how much grain he would owe after the harvest. A craftsman in Sardis could sell his dyed wool to traders from the east without worrying about sudden changes in fees. A caravan driver stopping at a way station found fresh horses ready and a simple meal provided as part of the regular service. These everyday improvements came directly from the clearer organization that the satrapies provided. Darius continued to travel among the provinces when needed, but the system now allowed him to spend more time at the central courts and at the building sites where new royal centers were taking shape. The satraps knew their duties, the inspectors made their circuits, and the roads linked everything together. The empire that Cyrus had gathered through personal leadership and Cambyses had extended through conquest had now been given a practical framework that could hold it together across generations. The work of dividing the territory and setting fixed rules had taken several careful years, but by the late 510s BCE, it was complete and functioning smoothly. This new structure freed Darius to turn his attention toward the great centers he had begun planning earlier. The satrapies would supply the resources and the labor for the halls and audience chambers that would display the empire's reach to everyone who visited them. The roads would carry the skilled workers from every province to the building sites in the south. The fixed tribute would pay their wages and feed the growing population around the new capitals. The system Darius had created was not meant to change daily life in the distant lands. It was meant to make sure that life could continue steadily while the center grew, stronger. The satrapies stood ready, each one managed by its governor, watched by its inspectors, and connected by the improved roads that now bound the whole realm together more firmly than ever before. Economic and cultural reforms. With the satrapies now operating under clear governors and regular inspections, Darius could turn to the practical details that would make trade and daily administration work more smoothly across the entire realm. He had seen during the rebuilding years how, different provinces used their own coins, their own systems of weighing goods, and their own languages for records. These differences slowed down merchants and created arguments at every border crossing. In the late 510s BC, he decided to introduce a set of standard practices that would link the provinces more closely without changing the local ways of life that had already proven reliable. The first change came with coinage. Darius ordered the minting of a new gold coin called the daric, named after himself, and a matching silver coin that could be used alongside it. The daric was struck at a central mint near the southern building site using gold that arrived as tribute from the eastern satrapies. Each coin carried a simple image of the king as an archer on one side and a clear mark of weight on the other. The silver coins followed the same standard so that one gold dirk equaled 20 silver pieces. Satraps in every province received samples of the new coins and instructions to accept they for tax payments and to encourage local markets to use them. Within a few seasons, the daric appeared in the bazaars of Babylon and the harbors of the Aeon coast. Merchants no longer had to weigh loose silver bars or argue over the purity of Lydian gold pieces. A trader from Egypt could sell linen in Sardis and receive coins that would be accepted without question back home in Memphis. The steady supply of official coins reduced disputes and made it easier for satraps to collect the fixed tribute in metal rather than in kind. At the same time, Darius standardized the weights and measures used for all tribute and trade goods. Teams of inspectors carried sets of bronze weights and measuring rods from the central court to every satrapy capital. The basic unit for grain was fixed at a level that matched the average barley harvest from a small field on the Iranian plateau. Silver was weighed in units that corresponded exactly to the new coins. Each satrap received a master set these measures and was required to keep copies at the main markets and collection points. Local officials checked every sack of grain and every bundle of wool against the standard before it left the province. If a merchant complained that his goods had been measured unfairly, the inspector could settle the matter on the spot with the official weights set. The change took hold gradually. Farmers in the Nile Delta delivered their grain, knowing the amount owed would be calculated the same way as in the river plains of Babylonia. Herders in the eastern grasslands sent their horses and received credit based on the same scale used for cavalry mounts on the plateau. Trade caravans moved faster because they no longer waited for each local market to use its own measuring system. The need for clear records across so many provinces led Darius to adopt Aramaic as the common language for administration. Aramaic was already spoken by merchants and scribes in many of the western and river districts, and it used a simple alphabet that could be written quickly on clay tablets or leather scrolls. Darius ordered that all official reports from satraps to the court be prepared in Aramaic while still allowing local scribes to keep temple accounts and village records in their own scripts. Scribes from Babylon and Egypt were brought to the central court for training in the new system. They learned to write the standard phrases for tribute lists, road repairs, and garrison supplies. Copies of these documents traveled with the inspectors so that governors could be checked against the same text. Aramaic did not replace the everyday languages of the provinces. Farmers in the Zagros valleys still spoke their Iranian dialects around the evening fires, and priests in Memphis continued their rituals in the ancient Egyptian tongue. But when a governor needed to report a canal repair or a satrap asked for extra grain after a poor flood, the message reached the king in the same clear form, no matter where it came from. The change made the flow of information steadier and reduced the number of misunderstandings that had sometimes delayed decisions in earlier years. Darius also continued the policy of supporting local temples and laws. Now, backed by the new administrative tools, each satrap received a portion of the provincial tribute to spend on repairs to shrines and on the upkeep of local courts. In Egypt, funds went toward clearing silt from temple basins along the Nile so that the daily offerings could continue without interruption. In Babylonia, the great ziggurat of Marduk received new brick facing on its lower levels, and the priests kept their traditional right to settle disputes over land ownership. In the western coastal cities, small grants helped maintain the temples of local deities, and city assemblies continued to handle minor civil cases according to their own customs. The king's inspectors checked that the money was used as intended, but they did not dictate how the temples should conduct their festivals or how the local judges should decide cases between neighbors. This steady support meant that communities across the empire felt their most important institutions remained secure. Temples stayed open, laws stayed familiar, and the royal treasury still received its agreed share. The combination of standard coins, uniform measures, Aramaic records, and continued local support brought a new level of stability to everyday economic life. Merchants who once carried their own scales and argued over exchange rates now traveled with a small bag of dar and knew the value would be the same at every stop. A caravan leaving the Indus Valley with gold dust could sell it in Babylon for rare silver coins that would buy timber in the western forests without any conversion problems. Satraps could plan their annual budgets more accurately because they knew exactly how much grain or silver would be required and how it would be measured. The royal court in the south received regular summaries in Aramaic that allowed Darius to compare the productivity of one province with another and to shift resources where they were needed most. In years when the Nile flood was lower than usual, extra barley from Babylonian stores could be sent south using the improved roads and the clear records that tracked every shipment. Farmers and craftsmen noticed the difference in small but important ways. A weaver in Sardis could sell her dyed wool for coins that kept their value from one season to the next. A date grower near the Euphrates could deliver his harvest to the collection point and receive a receipt written in the standard script that protected him from extra demands later. Village headmen in the eastern satrapies used the new measures to divide grazing rights fairly among families and then sent the royal share of horses without confusion. The steadier economic system encouraged more families to clear additional fields or to expand small workshops because they could count on fair treatment when they sold their surplus. Trade between satrapies increased steadily. Spices from the east reached the Aeon markets in larger quantities, while olive oil from the western coasts traveled back along the same roads to the Iranian plateau. The volume of goods moving through the way stations grew each year, and the royal treasury reflected the rise in reliable income. Darius kept track of these improvements through the monthly reports that arrived in Aramaic from every satrap. He reviewed the figures in the evenings and made notes about any province that showed unusual growth or sudden drops. When a satrap in the west reported higher than expected silver payments because of increased trade, Darius adjusted the next year's target upward by a modest amount and sent a short message of thanks. When a governor in the east asked for extra funds to repair a bridge after spring floods, the request was granted on the basis of the inspector's confirmation and the standardized records. This attention to detail kept the system balanced and prevented small problems from growing into larger ones. The cultural side of the reforms also strengthened the sense of connection across the provinces. Scribes trained in Aramaic could now move from one satrapy to another and find work keeping the same kind of records. Young men from Babylonian temple schools learned the new script alongside their traditional uniform and then took positions in the eastern frontier districts where local languages were different. The shared administrative language did not erase the many tongues spoken in the villages, but it gave the empire a practical way for people from distant regions to work together on common tasks. At the same time, the support for local temples meant that artisans in Egypt continued to carve their traditional reliefs, while metalworkers in the Lydian workshops produced fine jewelry using the new silver coins as a measure of value. Each province kept its own skilled crafts. Yet, the standard coinage and measures allowed those crafts to reach wider markets. By the early years of the 500s BCE, the economic and cultural reforms had become part of the daily working life of the empire. The daric and the silver coins circulated from the indust to the agen without losing their accepted value. The bronze weights and measuring rods were checked regularly by inspectors and used in every major market. Aramaic documents traveled with the tribute caravans and the royal messengers, keeping the court informed in a clear and consistent form. Local temples received their regular support, and local laws settled the everyday disputes that mattered most to ordinary families. The result was a level of stability that allowed the provinces to prosper without constant interference from the center. Darius could now direct more of the royal resources toward the building projects that were taking shape in the southern valleys. The steady income from the standardized tribute paid the wages of the stone carvers and carpenters who arrived from every satrapy. The improved roads carried the timber and the grain that fed the growing workforce. The common administrative language made it easier to coordinate the orders sent to distant quarries and forests. The satrapies continued to function smoothly under their governors, and the people in the villages and towns went about their seasonal tasks with the quiet confidence that the larger system supported rather than disrupted their routines. The reforms had taken several years to put in place, but they fitted naturally with the satrapy structure that had been established earlier. Standardized coinage and measures linked the economy. Aramaic records linked the administration, and continued respect for local temples and laws kept the loyalty of the provinces. Together, these changes turned the vast territory into a single working unit where goods, information, and resources moved with greater ease than ever before. The empire that had grown through conquest and reorganization now gained the practical tools that would support its daily life for generations. Darius reviewed the latest reports from the satraps and saw the steady rise in trade and the smooth collection of tribute. The work of economic and cultural reform had done its part, and the realm stood ready for the next phase of development at the great centers that were rising in the south, building the imperial heart. With the economic reforms now producing a steady flow of coin and the satrapies sending their tribute on schedule, Darius turned his attention to a project that had been taking shape in his mind for several years. He wanted a new center in the southern part of the Persian homeland, one that would serve as a visible gathering place for the empire rather than a crowded fortress like the older cities. The site he chose lay on a high terrace in the plain near the southern valleys, not far from the simple tomb where Cyrus rested at Pasargade. The ground rose gently from the surrounding fields, offering good drainage for the winter rains and open views toward the mountains. Work began in the early years of the 500 BCE, with teams of surveyors marking out the first foundations. Local Persian families supplied labor and oxen to level the rock surface, while stone was quarried from nearby hills and floated down small rivers on rafts during the spring floods. The terrace itself became the heart of the new center. Builders raised it in layers using blocks of dark limestone fitted so closely that a knife blade could not slip between them. The platform measured roughly 500 yards on each side and stood about 40 feet above the plain. Ramps wide enough for horsemen led up from the north and east, allowing processions to reach the top without steep climbs. Once the base was firm, the first structures went up around a large open square that would serve as the main gathering space. Darius visited the site whenever his travels brought him south, walking among the workmen and asking about the progress of the stone cutting and the supply of timber from the western provinces. He made small adjustments to the plans, always keeping in mind that the buildings should feel open to the mountain breezes rather than closed in like the thick-walled palaces of older lands. The most important hall rose at the center of the terrace. It was designed as a vast audience chamber with rows of tall columns carved from single blocks of stone. Each column stood 60 feet high and ended in capitals shaped like the heads of bulls or lions, symbols familiar to the horsemen of the plateau. The roof beams came from cedar forests in the Lebanon region, floated down the Mediterranean coast, and then carried overland by teams from the western satraps. Roof tiles and decorative bricks arrived from Babylonian workshops, while the stone floors were polished by craftsmen trained in Egyptian techniques. The hall could hold several thousand people at once, yet it remained airy because the walls were kept low between the columns and open to the sky on 3 sides. Darius intended this space for the great festivals when satraps and nobles came to present their annual reports and to receive honors from the king. Around the main hall, smaller buildings took shape for storage and living quarters. One long structure held the royal archives, where scribes copied the Aramaic records sent from every province. Another served as a treasury, where the dars and silver bars were counted and stored in sealed rooms. Living quarters for the king and his immediate family stood on the western edge of the terrace, simple in their outer walls, but fitted inside with carved wooden panels and woven hangings brought from the eastern satrapies. Gardens were planted between the buildings with trees and flowering shrubs carried from distant regions. Water channels cut into the rock brought clear streams from the mountains, filling small pools that caught the afternoon light and cooled the air on hot days. The entire layout remained practical, rather than crowded with wide-open spaces where horsemen could assemble and where ordinary families from the nearby valleys could gather during the major festivals. The work drew skilled men from every corner of the empire. Stonemasons from Egypt shaped the column bases and carved the fine reliefs along the stairways. Metal workers from Lydia set gold and silver inlays into the door frames and throne platforms. Carpenters from the Phoenician coast fitted the cedar beams and made the heavy doors that swung on bronze hinges. Potters from Babylon supplied glazed tiles for the walls of the smaller halls, while weavers from the Iranian tribes produced the wool carpets that covered the floors in winter. These groups lived in temporary camps at the base of the terrace, receiving their wages in the new dars and eating grain from the royal stores. Their families sometimes joined them for the quieter months, and the children played among the stone blocks while their fathers worked. The different crafts learned from one another during the long days. An Egyptian carver might show a Persian mason how to polish granite to a mirror finish, and a Lydian goldsmith might teach a Median metalworker a quicker way to shape thin sheets. The exchange happened quietly over shared meals and evening fires, strengthening the practical bonds that held the empire together. The art that decorated the buildings showed the diversity of the realm in a direct and orderly way. Along the great stairways that led up to the audience hall, sculptors carved long processions of figures bringing gifts to the king. Each group came from a different satrapy and wore the clothing and carried the products of its own land. The men from the western coast carried folded wool cloaks and small jars of olive oil. The Nubians from the southern border of Egypt led giraffes and carried ivory tusks. The Bactrians from the eastern river valleys brought horses and lapis lazuli. The Medes and Persians themselves appeared as the honored guards and nobles closest to the throne. The figures stood in calm rows, each about life-size with no sense of crowding or rivalry. The stone reliefs were painted in bright but simple colors, so that even those who could not read the Aramaic inscriptions could see at a glance the variety of peoples who now formed one realm. Darius reviewed the progress of these carvings himself and made sure that every province was represented fairly according to the tribute lists. Susa, the old Elumite city farther north, received its own improvements during the same period. Darius expanded the existing palace there and added a new audience hall that followed the same open style as the one on the southern terrace. The walls were faced with glazed bricks in blue and green, showing lions and bulls in rows, a technique brought by craftsmen from Babylon. The floors used polished stone from the nearby hills, and the columns were carved with the same bull capitals that appeared in the new center. Susa served as a second gathering point closer to the western and Babylonian provinces, so that satraps from those regions could present their reports without traveling the full distance south. The two centers worked together. Messengers rode between them along the improved roads, carrying copies of the same records, so that decisions made at one place could be confirmed at the other. The construction at both sites continued steadily through the 500 BCE. Each spring, new teams of workers arrived from the satrapies, replacing those who returned home after their service period. The satraps sent not only skilled men, but also the raw materials listed in their tribute agreements. Timber from the west, stone from the central mountains, and gold leaf from the eastern mines arrived on schedule because the inspectors checked the deliveries against the written orders. The work created a rhythm that fitted the seasonal life of the plateau. During the winter months, when the high passes were closed, the masons and carpenters finished indoor details in the workshops at the base of the terrace. In summer, they moved to the open air to set columns and carve the stairways. The pace remained even with no sudden rushes that might have exhausted the labor force. Ordinary families living near the sites benefited from the project in practical ways. Farmers sold their surplus barley and vegetables to the work camps at fair prices measured by the new standard weights. Herders brought sheep and goats for the evening meals and received dars in payment. Young men from the nearby villages sometimes joined the labor teams for a season, learning stone cutting or carpentry skills that they could use later in their own communities. The presence of the royal centers brought a steady market for local goods and a sense of connection to the larger empire. At festival times, the completed parts of the terrace opened to visitors, and people from the valleys climbed the ramps to see the processions carved in stone and to watch the king receive reports from distant satraps. Darius spent more time at the southern site as the main hall neared completion. He walked through the empty audience chamber in the early mornings, listening to the echo of his footsteps and picturing the day when the space would fill with nobles from every province. He ordered small changes to improve the flow of air through the columns and to make the stairways easier for older men to climb. The gardens received special care with irrigation channels that brought water even in the driest months so that the trees and flowers from distant lands could thrive. The king saw the new center not as a place of display alone, but as a working hub where the business of the empire could be conducted in comfort and with clear sight of the mountains that form the heart of the Persian lands. By the middle of the 490s BCE, the main structures stood finished enough for regular use. The audience hall hosted its first large gatherings, and the archives began to fill with the steady stream of Aramaic reports from the satrapies. Susa continued to serve its role in the north, handling the closer provinces, while the southern terrace managed the larger festivals and the storage of the royal treasures. The two centers together gave the empire visible points of focus without replacing the older sites at Pasargadae and Epatana. The work had drawn on the skills and materials of every province, yet it remained rooted in the practical style of the Iranian plateau. The columns rose straight and tall, the reliefs showed orderly processions, and the gardens provided quiet spaces where the king and his advisors could meet away from the heat of the day. The building projects marked a new phase in the life of the realm. Resources that had once supported military campaigns now supported skilled labor and lasting structures. The satrapies supplied workers and materials as part of their regular tribute, and the standardized coinage paid the wages without confusion. The common administrative language kept the orders clear, and the policy of respecting local customs meant that craftsmen could use the techniques they knew best. The result was a set of centers that reflected the empire's reach while keeping the simple strength of the Highland traditions. Darius reviewed the latest reports from the sites and saw the steady progress in the carved reliefs and the completed halls. The imperial heart was taking shape, built not through sudden conquest, but through the same careful organization that had guided the satrapies and the economic reforms. The people who traveled to the new centers for the festivals carried home stories of the open halls and the processions in stone. They spoke of the different clothing and the goods from every land shown along the stairways, and of the quiet order that allowed thousands to gather without crowding. These accounts spread through the provinces along the same roads that had carried the building materials. Families in distant valleys felt a closer tie to the center because they had seen or heard about the place where their own satrap presented the annual tribute and where the king received reports in the language that now linked the whole realm. The building of the imperial heart had drawn the empire together in a new and lasting way, giving it visible centers that would serve the kings who came after Darius for generations to come. Pushing the borders with the main halls and audience chambers now standing ready on the southern terrace and at Susa, Darius could direct more attention toward the outer edges of the realm where new opportunities for secure trade and resources lay waiting. The easternmost satrapies had already been organized, yet the lands beyond the Indus River still offered possibilities for further extension without major disruption. In the years around 515 to 510 BCE, he prepared a series of expeditions that would push Persian authority farther east and north, while strengthening the existing frontier lines. These moves followed the same careful pattern that had guided earlier expansions. Scouts went ahead to map water sources and grazing lands. Supplies were gathered at the last secure way stations, and local leaders received offers of protection in exchange for recognition of the king's authority. The first push moved into the broad plains beyond the Indians. Small columns of cavalry, supported by foot soldiers from the Gandhar and satrapy, crossed the river at several fords during the dry season when the water ran low. They carried grain from the royal stores and extra horses from the eastern pastures. The local rulers in these plains lived in scattered towns built of mud brick and relied on the river for their fields of millet and rice. Most of them had traded with the western satrapies for years, but had never paid regular tribute. Darius's forces approached each settlement in turn, offering the same terms used elsewhere. The leaders could keep their titles and their local customs if they sent an agreed amount of gold dust, ivory, and timber each year and allowed Persian patrols to guard the main trade routes. After short discussions and the exchange of small gifts, the majority accepted. A new district was added to the existing Gandharan satrapy with its collection point at a fortified crossing on the river. The extra gold from the river sands helped pay for the ongoing work at the southern building sites, while the timber strengthened the stockades along the northern frontiers. Farther north, the expeditions reached into the high valleys and steplands that lay beyond the earlier Jaxart's boundary. Here, the country was drier and the people more mobile, moving with their herds of horses and sheep according to the seasons. Darius sent mixed forces that included cavalry from the Bactrian satrapy and foot archers familiar with mountain fighting. They established small outposts at reliable wells and invited the nomadic leaders to meetings under truce flags. The offers were practical. The tribes could continue their seasonal movements if they stopped raiding the settled valleys to the south and supplied a number of young horsemen for the royal army each year. Many bands accepted after seeing that the Persians did not try to settle the open grasslands themselves. A few groups that continued to raid were met with swift cavalry actions that scattered their camps and drove them farther north. Within 2 seasons, the new frontier line held firm, and caravans carrying spices and precious stones could travel the extended routes with less risk. At the same time, Darius looked toward the northwest, where the empire touched the edges of the European mainland. In the region of Thrace, beyond the straits that separated Asia from Europe, local tribes controlled important trade paths that linked the Black Sea with the Aegean. Persian forces, supported by ships from the Phoenician and Greek coastal cities, crossed the water in stages. They moved along the coastal plains, securing harbors and building small forts at river crossings. The Thracian leaders were offered the usual arrangement. They could keep their own chiefs and their traditional ways if they provided timber for shipbuilding and allowed safe passage for merchants. Most accepted after brief negotiations, and a new satrapy was organized with its center at a fortified town near the coast. The timber from these northern forests proved especially useful for the expanding fleet that now guarded the sea lanes between the Aegean and the Levantine ports. The campaigns in the northwest also brought contact with Scythian nomads, who lived beyond the Danube River. These horsemen moved across wide grasslands in large bands, carrying their belongings on wagons and living in felt tents. Darius prepared a larger expedition to secure the region against their raids. The army assembled at the Thracian coast with cavalry from the eastern satraps and infantry from the western provinces. Ships carried supplies along the Black Sea, while the main force marched overland. The Scythians avoided open battle at first, preferring to draw the Persians deeper into their country by retreating and burning the grass behind them. Darius kept his columns close together and maintained supply lines back to the coast. After several weeks of marching, the two sides met in a series of running fights along the riverbanks. The Persian cavalry used its discipline to hold formation while the archers delivered steady volleys. The Scythians eventually withdrew farther north, and Darius established a line of outposts along the lower Danube to protect the new Thracian districts. The expedition did not attempt to conquer the open steppe, but secured the frontier well enough for trade routes to function safely. These extensions of the borders brought steady benefits to the empire as a whole. The additional gold from the lands beyond the Indus increased the supply of dars without raising taxes in the older satraps. The horses supplied by the northern tribes strengthened the royal cavalry units that trained on the Iranian plateau. The timber from Thrace supported shipbuilding at the Phoenician ports, which in turn protected the sea trade that carried Egyptian grain and Lydian wool. The new outposts along the frontiers required only small permanent garrisons because the local leaders, who had accepted Persian authority, helped guard the roads in exchange for their confirmed positions. Inspectors traveled the extended routes on the same schedule as before, carrying the standard weights and the Aramaic records that kept the administration consistent. The people in the older provinces noticed the results in their daily markets. Merchants in Babylon could buy larger quantities of Indian spices because the caravans from the east arrived more regularly. Workshops in Sardis received steadier supplies of northern timber for their fine furniture. Farmers along the Nile sent their grain northward, knowing that the ships protected by the growing fleet would reach their destinations without loss. The SAT traps in the new districts sent their tribute on the same fixed scale as the older ones, measured by the standard weights and recorded in the common administrative language. The system that had been built over the previous years stretched to cover the added territory without strain. Darius reviewed the reports from the frontier satraps each season and adjusted the required contributions according to the actual resources of each district. When a poor winter left the northern tribes with fewer horses, he lowered their quota for that year and noted the reason in the royal archives. When the gold yield from the new Indus districts proved higher than expected, he used the surplus to pay for additional road repairs along the main highway. This flexibility kept the new borders stable and prevented the kind of resentment that had fueled earlier revolts. The SAT traps in the extended provinces received the same oversight from the traveling inspectors, and the way stations on the longer routes were stocked with the same supplies of grain and fresh horses. The border campaigns also brought small exchanges of knowledge that strengthened the empire's practical skills. Horsemen from the eastern plains taught Persian officers new ways to scout across open country using the position of the stars at night. Ship captains from the Phoenician ports learned better routes along the Thracian coast from local pilots who had sailed those waters for generations. Scribes in the new districts began keeping their records in Aramaic alongside their own scripts so that reports reached the southern terrace without delay. These quiet transfers of skill fitted naturally into the daily work of the satraps and added to the steady improvement of the whole realm. By the end of the 510s BCE, the empire's borders had been pushed outward in several directions while remaining firmly under the same administrative system. The satrapies now numbered more than 20, each one connected by the improved roads and linked by the standard coinage and measures. Tribute continued to arrive on schedule, supporting the building projects at the imperial centers and the maintenance of the garrisons on the frontiers. The people in the older heartland continued their seasonal movements of herds and the planting of barley fields. Now, with the added security that came from knowing the outer edges were guarded, merchants traveled the longer routes with greater confidence, carrying goods that enriched markets from the Aeon to the Indus. Darius could look at the maps kept in the archives at Susa and see a realm that stretched farther than any earlier power had managed to hold together. The new districts contributed their resources without draining the center, and the satrapy system scaled smoothly to cover the added territory. The work of pushing the borders had been carried out methodically using the same practical approach that had guided the reorganization after the succession crisis. The empire continued to function as a single connected whole with its outer edges now secured and its inner provinces stronger because of the steady flow of new goods and the safer trade routes. The southern terrace and the halls at Susa stood ready to receive the reports and the gifts from the extended lands, giving visible form to the reach that the reforms and the border campaigns had achieved. The seasonal cycles on the Iranian plateau went on unchanged. Families moved their flocks to summer pastures and harvested their barley in the autumn. The roads carried the tribute caravans and the royal messengers without interruption. The dars, minted from the new gold, circulated alongside the silver coins in every market. The Aramaic records kept the administration clear, and the inspectors continued their regular circuits. The empire had grown larger, yet it remained rooted in the same steady habits that had sustained it from the days when Cyrus first united the tribes. The work on the frontiers had added strength without upsetting the balance that Darius had worked so carefully to create. Challenges in the west with the frontiers now extended into the plains beyond the Indus and the northern reaches of Thrace, secured by the late 510s BCE. The satraps along the Aegean coast settled into the same steady routines that governed the rest of the realm. The Greek cities in the region known as Ionia had accepted Persian authority decades earlier under Cyrus, and had continued under the fixed tribute system Darius established. Their harbors at Mytis, Ephesus, and several smaller ports handled trade in olive oil, wine, and fine pottery, sending the agreed silver payments each year to the satrap at Sardis. Local assemblies still chose their own officials and maintained their temples to the old deities, while Persian inspectors made regular visits to check the records kept in Aramaic alongside the Greek accounts. Farmers in the coastal valleys planted their vineyards and olive groves according to the familiar seasons, and merchants sailed to the islands and mainland settlements without interference as long as the tribute arrived on time. The satrap at Sardis during these years was a capable noble who kept the roads repaired and the garrisons supplied from local grain stores. He met with the city leaders once each season to review the payments and to hear any requests for adjustments in the tax levels when harvests were poor. Most of the Ionian Greeks found the arrangement workable because it brought protection from pirates and allowed their ships to trade freely along the coasts. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet dissatisfaction grew among some of the wealthier families who remembered the days when their cities had operated with more independence. They resented the fixed tribute and the presence of Persian officials who, though respectful, represented a distant king in the highlands. These feelings remained private at first, shared only in small gatherings after the evening meals or during festivals when the wine flowed freely. In 499 BCE, the tension in Mytis reached a breaking point. The city's leading figure, Arestarchus, had been involved in a failed attempt to extend influence northward into the Black Sea region, and when the effort collapsed, he feared the satrap would hold him responsible. Rather than wait for an inspection, Aristo called together the other Ionian leaders and proposed open resistance. He argued that the time had come to throw off the Persian arrangements and restore full self-rule. Messengers traveled quickly between the coastal cities, and within weeks most of them joined the movement. The rebels seized the local Persian officials, many of whom were allowed to leave peacefully rather than face harm. They burned the tax records and declared that no more silver would be sent to Sardis. Aristo then sailed across the Aegean to seek support from the mainland Greek cities, hoping that shared language and customs would bring help. Athens and Eretria responded to the appeal. Both cities sent small contingents of ships and men, seeing the revolt as a chance to weaken Persian control over the sea lanes that affected their own trade. The combined Ionian and mainland forces crossed to the mainland coast near Sardis in the spring of 498 BCE. They moved inland quickly and reached the satrap center before the main Persian garrison could assemble. The rebels set fire to parts of the lower town, though the citadel itself held firm. The satrap gathered what troops he had and drove the attackers back toward the coast. The raid on Sardis did not topple Persian authority, but the smoke from the burning buildings sent a clear signal that trouble had broken out in the west. Messengers rode the royal road eastward, carrying the satrap's urgent report, and Darius received the news at the southern terrace within weeks. Darius responded with the same measured approach he had used during the earlier revolts. He did not order a hasty counterattack that might have damaged the productive coastal lands. Instead, he instructed the satrap to call on nearby garrisons from the Anatolian interior and to keep the main roads open so that supplies could reach the loyal cities. At the same time, he sent a trusted commander with a larger force drawn from the central provinces. The army moved westward along the improved highway, stopping at the way stations for fresh horses and grain. By the summer of 497 BCE, the Persian troops had reached the Ionian coast and began reclaiming the smaller cities one by one. Most surrendered after short sieges once they saw the size of the approaching columns, and the satrap offered terms that allowed the ordinary citizens to return to their fields and workshops. The main fighting centered on Mytis, the city that had led the revolt. The rebels strengthened their walls and called on their remaining allies for support. Athenian and Eretrian ships tried to bring reinforcements, but the Persian fleet now expanded with vessels from the Phoenician ports, and the loyal Greek cities blocked the sea approaches. In 494 BCE, the Persian forces closed in on Mytis by land and sea. The city fell after a determined defense, and the Persian commanders allowed most of the population to remain rather than dispersing them. Aristogaras had already fled earlier, and the other rebel leaders were brought before the satrap for judgment. Darius later reviewed the reports and confirmed that only those directly responsible for the uprising faced punishment, while the farmers and craftsmen could keep their land and continue their trades. The tribute levels stayed the same as before, with no extra penalties imposed on the province as a whole. The suppression of the Ionian revolt took several years, but it ended without widespread destruction of the coastal economy. The harbors resumed their trade once the sea lanes were cleared, and the vineyards and olive groves produced their usual harvests the following season. The SAT trap at Sardis tightened the inspection schedule for a time and made sure that each city sent its tribute on the exact date agreed in the written records. Yet he also listened to the complaints that had fueled the unrest and adjusted some of the local fees that had seemed particularly burdensome. This balance helped restore calm along the Aeon fringe while reminding the cities that the Persian system would not tolerate open defiance. News of the revolt and its outcome reached the mainland Greek cities through returning ships and merchants. Athens and Eretria had lost men in the fighting and now expected some form of response from the king in the east. Darius, reviewing the reports at the southern terrace, decided that the mainland cities needed to understand the reach of Persian authority. In 492 BCE, he sent a fleet and army under one of his experienced commanders to cross the Aeon and secure the islands that had supported the rebels. The force moved methodically from island to island, receiving submissions from most of the smaller communities and establishing garrisons where necessary. The expedition then turned toward the mainland coast of Eretria. The city resisted briefly before its walls were breached, and the Persian commanders carried out a measured punishment by removing some of the leading families while leaving the rest of the population in place. The following year, in 490 BCE, the Persian forces advanced toward Athens itself. The army landed at the Bay of Marathon, a day's march from the city, and set up camp on the plain. The Athenians, supported by a small contingent from another mainland city, marched out to meet them. The two sides faced each other across the open ground for several days, while the Persian commanders waited for the right moment to engage. When the battle finally came, the Greek forces used their knowledge of the local terrain and their close-order fighting style to push the Persian lines back toward the ships. The Persian commanders, seeing that the landing had not achieved its aim, re-embarked the troops and sailed back toward the Ionian coast. The action at Marathon was limited in scale and did not threaten the core of the empire. Yet, it showed Darius that the mainland cities would require careful handling rather than a single swift campaign. Darius spent the next years reviewing the Western reports and planning how to strengthen the satrapies along the Ion without repeating the mistakes that had led to the revolt. He ordered additional way stations built on the roads leading to the coast and increased the size of the garrisons in the loyal cities. At the same time, he confirmed the local assemblies in their right to manage everyday affairs as long as the tribute arrived on schedule. The Ionian cities gradually returned to their former prosperity with merchants, sailing to Egypt and the Black Sea ports under the protection of the Persian fleet. The dars and silver coins continued to circulate in the harbors, and the standardized measures ensured fair trade at every market. The challenges in the West tested the satrapy system and the reforms Darius had put in place. Yet the empire absorbed the strain without fracturing. The roads carried the reports from Sardis to the southern terrace within weeks, and the inspectors continued their circuits to make sure the adjusted arrangements were followed. Farmers in the coastal valleys harvested their olives and paid their share, without further unrest, while the Greek cities kept their temples and their festivals. The brief clashes with the mainland had shown the limits of Persian reach across the sea, but they had also demonstrated the steadiness of the central administration that could respond to trouble without disrupting the daily life of the provinces. Darius continued to receive detailed accounts from the Western satrap and to make small changes based on what he learned. The experience of the Ionian revolt and the actions at Marathon became part of the practical knowledge stored in the royal archives available for future reference when similar situations arose. The empire remained connected by the same roads, the same coinage, and the same records that had served it so well in the eastern expansions. The western fringes, though distant, stayed within the larger system, contributing their silver and their trade goods while keeping the local customs that had always defined them. The people in the Ionian cities and the mainland settlements noticed that life returned to its familiar patterns after the fighting ended. Ships loaded with wine and pottery left the harbors on schedule, and the markets in Sardis accepted the same weights and measures as before. Farmers repaired their fields damaged during the brief campaigns and planted next season's crops with the quiet confidence that the tribute level would remain fixed. The satrap at Sardis kept his meetings with the city leaders regular and practical, listening to their concerns while reminding them of the benefits of safe roads and protected routes. The empire had faced its first significant test in the west, and the structures Darius had built over the previous decades had held firm. As the 480s BCE approached, Darius could look at the reports from every satrapy and see that the realm continued to function as a single working whole. The challenges in the west had been met with the same steady organization that had guided the border extensions and the building projects. The Ionian coast and the Ionian islands remained part of the larger territory connected by the royal road and the fleet that now patrolled the sea routes. The southern terrace and the halls at Susa stood ready to receive the tribute and the visitors from the western provinces, displaying in their carved reliefs the figures of the Greek cities alongside those from every other land. The empire had grown through careful expansion and had weathered its first major internal test in the west, emerging with its administration intact and its provinces still contributing according to the fixed agreements. The work of holding the distant fringes would continue guided by the same practical approach that had defined Darius's rule from the moment he took the throne. The legacy of two great kingses, the 480s BCE, continued, and the reports from the western satrapies arrived with their regular accounts of restored trade and steady tribute. Darius could see the full shape of the realm that had grown under his guidance and under the earlier work of Cyrus. The empire now stretched from the Aeaean coast to the plains beyond the Indus, held together by the satraps. The fixed tribute, the royal road, and the common administrative language that allowed messages to move without delay. Cyrus had begun the process decades earlier by uniting the Iranian tribes and showing that conquered peoples could keep their customs if they accepted a single authority. Darius had taken those foundations and built a system of governors, inspectors, standardized coins and measures, and open audience halls where the diversity of the provinces could be displayed in orderly processions carved in stone. The two reigns together created a structure that would outlast both kings and serve as a model for later rulers across the ancient world. Darius spent his later years moving between the southern terrace and Susa, reviewing the latest lists from every satrapy and making small adjustments to keep the balance steady. He confirmed the arrangements in the Ionian cities after the revolt had been settled, ensuring that the harbors continued to send their silver while the local assemblies handled their own daily affairs. The fleet that had grown during the western campaigns now protected the sea routes that carried Egyptian grain to the Aeaean markets and Lydian wool back to the Iranian plateau. In the east, the new districts beyond the Indus supplied their gold dust and horses on the same fixed scale as the older provinces, with inspectors checking the deliveries against the written records. The dars minted from that gold circulated alongside the silver coins in every bazaar, making trade smoother than it had been under any earlier power. The building centers themselves became working hubs where satraps and nobles gathered each year to present their reports and receive honors. The carved reliefs along the stairways showed the figures from every land bringing their products to the king. A permanent record of the empire's reach that travelers from distant provinces could see for themselves. The archives filled with the steady stream of Aramaic documents, allowing Darius and his advisors to compare the productivity of one region with another and to shift resources where they were needed most. When a poor flood affected the Nile Valley, extra barley from Babylonian stores moved south along the roads without disrupting the fixed tribute levels elsewhere. The system responded to local conditions while keeping the overall structure intact. Darius died in 486 BCE after a reign of more than 30 years. His body was prepared according to the customs of the plateau and placed in a tomb cut into the rock face near the southern terrace, a simple chamber that matched the modest style Cyrus had chosen for his own resting place. The transition to his son Xerxes happened smoothly because the satrapies were already functioning under clear rules and the inspectors continued their circuits without pause. Xerxes confirmed the governors in their positions and maintained the same policies of fixed tribute and respect for local customs. The empire continued its daily work of planting barley in the highland valleys, moving herds to summer pastures, and sending caravans along the protected roads. The legacy of Cyrus and Darius had become the practical framework that guided the realm forward. Xerxes faced new challenges in the west, including larger campaigns against the mainland Greek cities. Yet, the administrative system held firm. Satraps sent their troops and supplies according to the established quotas, and the royal road carried the reports that kept the king informed. The coinage and the standardized measures continued to support trade even when military efforts drew resources in one direction. Later kings built on the same foundations, adding their own projects at the imperial centers and extending the network of roads and way stations. The satrapy structure proved flexible enough to absorb changes in leadership and to weather occasional frontier troubles without collapsing into the separate pieces that had existed before Cyrus. The tolerance that Cyrus had practiced from his earliest victories and that Darius had, written into the daily administration, became one of the empire's most enduring strengths. Temples in Egypt and Babylon continued their ancient rites. Greek cities kept their assemblies, and nomadic tribes on the eastern steppe maintained their seasonal movements. Each group contributed its tribute and its skills while keeping the habits that made its land productive. This approach reduced the resentment that had fueled earlier revolts and allowed the provinces to prosper under a single authority. Merchants traveled from the Indus to the Aeon knowing that the same weights and the same coins would be accepted at every market, and farmers planted their fields with the confidence that the royal share would be taken fairly and the roads would remain open. The administrative habits Darius had established also shaped the way later rulers managed their territories. The traveling inspectors, the fixed tribute lists, the common language for reports, and the clear division of duties among the satraps provided a model that could be applied across vast distances. Kings who came after Xerxes consulted the same archives and followed the same practice of reviewing provincial accounts each season. The system was not rigid. Governors could request adjustments for unusual conditions, and the king could respond with written orders that reached the distant satrapies within weeks. This balance of central oversight and local flexibility kept the empire functioning for more than 2 centuries, longer than any earlier Mesopotamian or Egyptian power had managed to hold its lands together. The imperial centers at the southern terrace and at Susa stood as visible symbols of the combined work of Cyrus and Darius. Visitors from every province climbed the wide stairways and saw the carved processions that included their own people alongside those from distant lands. The audience halls hosted the annual gatherings, where satraps presented their reports and received confirmation of their positions. The gardens and water channels provided quiet spaces where advisors could discuss the business of the realm away from the heat of the day. These places were not empty displays. They were working centers where the records were kept, the coins were counted, and the decisions that affected every satrapy were made. The open style of the architecture, with its tall columns and airy design, reflected the practical needs of the highland climate while incorporating techniques from the many regions that now formed the empire. The roads that Cyrus had first improved and Darius had expanded into a network of way stations remained the arteries that kept the provinces connected. Messengers could travel from the Indus to Sardis in a matter of weeks, carrying the Aramaic documents that linked the administration. Tribute caravans moved steadily, carrying grain from Egypt, gold from the eastern rivers, timber from the northern forests, and horses from the steppelands. The same routes carried merchants with their goods and craftsmen, traveling between the satraps to share their skills. The steady flow of resources and information turned the vast territory into a single economic body rather than a collection of separate lands. The military organization that had begun with the Persian and Median cavalry under Cyrus grew into a more structured force under Darius and continued under later kings. Each satrapy maintained its required contingent and sent it along the roads when called. The mixed garrisons on the frontiers included local troops who knew the terrain, supported by central units that could move quickly when needed. This system allowed the empire to respond to challenges on distant borders without draining the resources of the heartland. The lessons learned in the eastern campaigns and the western revolts became part of the practical knowledge passed to new commanders, ensuring that the army served the larger purpose of protecting trade and maintaining order. Ordinary families across the provinces lived their lives within the framework the two kings had created. Farmers in the Nile Valley planted their crops according to the flood and delivered their grain to the collection points measured by the standard weights. Herders on the Iranian plateau moved their flocks to summer pastures and sent the royal share of wool and meat each autumn. Merchants in the Ionian harbors loaded their ships with wine and pottery, paying the fixed fees recorded in the common script. The seasonal cycles continued without interruption, supported by the safer roads and the reliable administration. Children learned the same skills their parents had known. Yet they also heard stories of the distant king whose system protected their fields and allowed their surplus to reach wider markets. The empire that Cyrus had gathered through personal leadership and fair dealing, and that Darius had organized through careful records and steady institutions, endured as one of the largest political structures the ancient world had known. It shaped the way later powers thought about governance, showing that a vast territory could be held together by clear rules, regular communication, and respect for local customs. The satrapy system, the standardized coinage, the network of roads, and the policy of tolerance became models that influenced administration long after the Achaemenid line ended. Travelers who passed the Behistun inscription or climbed the stairways at the southern terrace saw in stone, and in practice, the order that Cyrus and Darius had built together. The quiet strength of the realm rested in the daily habits that had sustained it from the beginning. Barley fields ripened under the summer sun on the plateau. Caravans moved along the protected routes, and the sacred fires burned in the open shrines tended by the Magi. The two kings had taken the simple life of the Iranian tribes and turned it into the core of a system that reached across continents. Their combined work created an empire that functioned steadily for generations, providing security for farmers and merchants alike, while allowing each province to keep the customs that made it strong. The legacy of Cyrus and Darius was not a story of endless conquest, but of practical organization and balanced rule that allowed ordinary life to continue under a single authority. As the years passed and new kings took the throne, the structures remained in place. The roads carried the same tribute, the inspectors made their circuits, and the audience halls hosted the same gatherings. The empire continued to draw on the foundations laid in the mid-550s BCE when Cyrus first united the tribes, and on the reforms Darius completed in the decades after 522 BCE. The result was a realm that endured through changing reigns and occasional frontier troubles, shaping the ancient world's understanding of how large and diverse territories could be governed effectively. Take a slow breath and let the weight of the day slip away. Feel the fan's soft hum blending with the distant call of nightbirds, a gentle reminder that the world keeps its own calm order, even when we rest. The empire those two kings shaped has long since passed into memory. Yet the simple truths they left behind, fair dealings, clear records, and respect for each land's way, still echo in the way we think about bringing different peoples together. There is comfort in knowing that steady work and thoughtful rule can create something lasting, something that outlives any single lifetime. Dim the lights a little more if you like. Let your